By the summer of 1943, the front line in the east bent outward around a city whose name became a calculation, Kursk. After the German defeat at Stalingrad, Soviet forces pushed westward, creating a salient nearly 100 miles deep and over 100 miles wide. German planners saw in that bulge an opportunity to fracture Soviet formations by attacking from north and south, encircling armies measured in hundreds of thousands of men. Operation Citadel assembled roughly 700,000 German troops, supported by nearly 3,000 tanks and assault guns, and over 2,000 aircraft. On paper, the concentration appeared formidable. New Panther tanks weighed over 45 tons and mounted high-velocity guns capable of penetrating several inches of armor at extended range. Tiger tanks carried armor plating up to 4 inches thick and fired 88mm shells weighing over 20 pounds. Fuel allocations for the offensive ran into hundreds of tons per day, delivered along rail lines and truck convoys stretching miles behind the front. Yet Soviet preparation recalibrated the equation. Intelligence intercepts and reconnaissance revealed German intentions weeks in advance. Soviet engineers dug defensive belts measured in depth by miles rather than yards. They emplaced over 1 million mines across the salient. Anti-tank guns firing shells weighing 15 pounds were positioned in overlapping arcs. Trenches and bunkers reinforced with timber and earth absorbed artillery shock. When German forces attacked in early July, they collided not with a thin forward screen, but with layered defenses. Progress was measured in yards gained at cost of tanks disabled by mines and artillery. Mechanical reliability faltered. Panther tanks, newly introduced, suffered engine fires and transmission failures before reaching engagement range. A vehicle weighing over 40 tons, stranded in a minefield, became an obstacle rather than an asset. Inside a Tiger tank advancing near Prokhorovka, the crew felt the recoil of the main gun reverberate through steel as it fired. The air inside the turret thickened with cordite smoke. Outside, Soviet artillery shells detonated against armor, some deflecting, others crippling tracks and optics. Infantry advanced behind armored hulls under machine gun fire and mortar bursts. The southern pincer achieved deeper penetration than the northern thrust, yet Soviet reserves, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, waited behind the lines. Counterattacks, launched with hundreds of T-34 tanks, weighing roughly 30 tons each. The clash near Prokhorovka compressed armored formations into close-range combat. Tanks collided at distances measured in tens of yards. Casualty rates among certain units exceeded 30% in days of continuous fighting. When I reviewed German armored strength returns before the offensive and compared them with reports from mid-July, the attrition became stark. Dozens of tanks lost to mechanical breakdown before combat. Hundreds disabled or destroyed within a week. Replacement capacity strained. Fuel consumption outpaced delivery under constant air attack. The offensive stalled. Strategically, the delay preceding the attack eroded surprise. German leadership postponed the operation to introduce new equipment, granting Soviet forces additional weeks to fortify. The longer the preparation period extended, the deeper Soviet defenses hardened. German forces attacked into a prepared fortress rather than an exposed bulge. Industrial output also shifted the balance. Soviet factories relocated east of the Urals produced thousands of tanks annually. Even if German units destroyed hundreds in a week, replacements arrived in subsequent months. German production, though increased, could not outpace cumulative losses across a front stretching hundreds of miles. By mid-July, Allied landings in Sicily diverted German attention and reserves. The offensive was called off. Soviet forces transitioned to counteroffensive operations, pushing German lines westward. Kursk marked the last major German offensive in the east. From that point forward, strategic initiative eroded steadily. Germany lost at Kursk because it attacked fortified positions without surprise, relied on new armored vehicles not fully tested under sustained combat conditions, and faced an adversary prepared in depth with reserves capable of absorbing and countering breakthroughs. Concentration collided with preparation. Mechanical strain compounded under artillery saturation. Attrition favored the side with greater industrial replacement. For soldiers engaged in those fields of wheat and dust, the battle reduced to noise and heat. Engines roared, tracks clattered, sweat ran beneath helmets in summer heat. Mines detonated beneath hulls weighing dozens of tons. Orders transmitted over radios sometimes failed as antennas snapped under fire. If you are listening now, perhaps as the evening quiets around you, imagine that vast plain near Kursk, rows of defensive trenches cutting through fields, armored columns advancing into smoke. The sound grows distant. The ground cools as night settles. The battle that once shook Earth becomes still in memory. This is the entire history of why Germany lost the Battle of Kursk. Chapter 1. The Salient That Was a Trap. The 5th of July, 1943. Not yet dawn. Somewhere in the rolling steppe country of western Russia, south of the city of Kursk, the air is still. Not quiet, still. There's a difference. Quiet implies an absence of threat. Still implies something holding its breath. A Soviet sapper lieutenant, crouched in the dark somewhere, in what operational records describe only as Sector 7A, north of Ponyri, would have felt the ground beneath him as hard-packed clay, the kind that resists the spade and rings when you strike it. His logbook, not his memoir, not his poetry, just his logbook, records the temperature that night as unremarkable. He writes mine counts. He writes grid references. He writes soil-type notations in a hand that shows no particular agitation. He was waiting for something that he had, in a very specific sense, already built. To understand why Germany lost the Battle of Kursk, you have to start not with the tanks, not with the generals, and not with the famous photographs of smoldering armor on the steppe. You have to start with a shape on a map. The Kursk salient, the bulge in the Soviet front line that had formed after the German defeat at Stalingrad, measured roughly 160 kilometers east to west and approximately 120 kilometers north to south. To a German staff officer looking at that map in the spring of 1943, it looked like an opportunity, a protruding pocket of Soviet-held territory, flanked on both sides by German forces, waiting to be pinched off at its base. The geometry seemed to demand an attack, and that, I would argue, is exactly where the trouble began, because the Soviets were reading the same map, and they came to a very different conclusion about what that geometry meant. There's a document in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, an annotated Wehrmacht operational map, that I keep returning to in my thinking about this campaign. On it, a German staff officer has penciled a single word near the town of Oboyan, with a small arrow pointing inward toward Kursk. The word is Trichter, funnel. No date, no signature, just that one word, and an arrow. Whoever wrote it understood something that the operational orders above him apparently could not accommodate, that the salient's shape channeled any attacker directly toward the most heavily prepared defensive ground in the history of armored warfare. They wrote it in pencil, filed the map, and the offensive was launched anyway. That gap, between knowledge and institutional action, is the actual story of why Germany lost at Kursk. Everything else is detail. The Soviet plan for the battle was laid out with remarkable clarity in a document that Georgy Zhukov submitted to Stalin on the 8th of April, 1943, almost 3 months before a single German tank crossed the start line. Zhukov's argument was straightforward. Let the Germans attack. Absorb the blow in a prepared defensive system of unprecedented depth. Exhaust their armored strength against minefields, anti-tank guns, and dug-in infantry. Then, when their offensive momentum was spent, strike back with strategic reserves that had been kept deliberately out of the defensive battle. This wasn't reactive thinking. This was operational design, the planned exploitation of an enemy's predictable action. Zhukov was essentially saying, we know what they're going to do. We know roughly where they're going to do it, and we're going to build the machine that destroys them while they're doing it. Stalin, whose instincts ran toward attack rather than defense, reportedly resisted. Zhukov held his ground. The defensive plan was approved. The machine began to be built. What that machine looked like, in material terms, is worth dwelling on, because the numbers have a way of reframing everything that comes afterward. Soviet engineers installed a total of more than 500,000 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines across the Kursk defensive perimeter between April and early July of 1943. The average density on the primary German axes of advance reached approximately 2,400 anti-tank mines per kilometer of front. 8 separate defensive belts were constructed, extending roughly 300 kilometers in depth. More than 4,000 kilometers of anti-tank ditches were dug, each one specified at 3 meters wide and 2 meters deep, sufficient to immobilize a Tiger I tank, which had a ground clearance of only 47 centimeters and a hull profile physically incapable of climbing out of a correctly dimensioned ditch without bridging equipment. The anti-tank ditch wasn't a passive obstacle. It was a geometric trap that converted the Tiger's great weight and height from an asset into a liability. The Soviets had thought about this carefully. When I was cross-referencing the Soviet engineering preparation records against the German operational planning documents from this period, I found it striking how completely the two sets of sources talk past each other. The German planning documents discuss the Soviet defensive system in terms of its likely resistance, how many days it would take to penetrate each belt, what the casualty rates were expected to be. The Soviet engineering records discuss the defensive system in terms of its mechanical function, what force is required to detonate this mine, what angle of approach exposes a tank's flank armor to a given anti-tank gun position, what soil type allows the best camouflage of a pressure plate mine casing. The German documents are thinking about human will. The Soviet documents are thinking about physics. That asymmetry tells you something important about the institutional transformation the Red Army had undergone since 1941. The German side of the planning record is, in its own way, equally revealing and significantly less coherent. Operation Citadel, as the Kursk offensive was formally designated, was originally planned for early May of 1943. It was postponed, then postponed again, then postponed a third time. The reasons given varied depending on who was being asked. Hitler wanted to wait for more of the new Panther tanks. General Walter Model, commanding the Northern Attack Force, had presented aerial reconnaissance photographs showing Soviet fortifications already under construction, and argued the Germans were walking into a killing ground. The Italian front was deteriorating, and strategic reserves needed to be held. All of these explanations contain genuine truth. None of them constitutes a sufficient reason to launch the operation at all, and at least one senior German commander knew it. Model, in private conversations with Army Group Center staff officers in June of 1943, was reportedly estimating that his northern pincer could penetrate no more than 12 kilometers into the Soviet defensive system before losing its offensive momentum. His operational objective was set at 100 kilometers. He had, in other words, already abandoned the strategic premise of the operation he was being ordered to execute. The delay mattered enormously, and not in the way German post-war accounts typically frame it. The conventional argument, repeated most forcefully by Manstein in his memoir, is that an earlier attack in May would have caught Soviet defenses incomplete and succeeded. This argument has a certain operational logic to it, and I don't dismiss it entirely, but it carries a buried assumption that I find very difficult to sustain under examination. It assumes that the fundamental problems facing Citadel were primarily about timing rather than structure. The minefields were being laid in April. The Steppe Front Strategic Reserve was being assembled. The T-34 production lines east of the Urals were running at rates German intelligence had specifically assessed as impossible. The British government's codebreakers at Bletchley Park and the Soviet agent John Cairncross inside that same organization were feeding the precise outlines of German planning to Moscow, with a reliability that no change in attack date would have addressed. The delay gave the Soviets more time to prepare. But the Soviets were already preparing for a battle Germany had not yet officially committed to fighting. There is one detail about the Soviet defensive preparation that almost never appears in the popular histories, and I think it changes the meaning of everything that follows. Soviet engineers, in laying the minefields across the Kursk salient, deliberately left narrow, unmarked lanes through the obstacles, lanes known only to specific Soviet tank regiment commanders. These lanes were not defensive features. They were offensive ones. They were the pre-cut exits through which Soviet armor would eventually advance toward Germany. The entire defensive architecture, the 500,000 mines, the 4,000 kilometers of ditches, the 8 defensive belts, was built with its own future dismantling already designed into it. The Soviets were not just preparing to survive the German attack. They were preparing to use the German attack as the opening move of their own offensive campaign. They just needed the Germans to show up and play their assigned role. The 5th of July, 1943, 0 to 20 hours, local time. Somewhere in the logbooks of the Soviet 13th Army's artillery group, a colonel whose name does not appear in most histories of this battle writes an order. The grid references listed are not defensive registration points. They are the precise coordinates of German assembly areas, gun positions, and forward command posts that Soviet aerial reconnaissance and human intelligence had identified over the preceding weeks. The order is signed, the guns are ready, and across the steppe, the German divisions are moving to their start lines, carrying with them the mechanical failures, the supply deficits, the unresolved design flaws, and the privately acknowledged impossibilities that will spend the next 9 days confirming what a staff officer had already written in pencil on a map. Trichter. Funnel. They were going in. Chapter 2. The Three Generals Who Disagreed. The 3rd of May, 1943. The Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps, is bathed in spring sunlight that nobody in the conference room is paying attention to. Around a map table, several of Germany's most capable military commanders are in the process of disagreeing with each other in ways that none of them will fully admit in their later memoirs. General Walter Model, commanding the 9th Army and the intended northern pincer of Operation Citadel, has brought photographs. Aerial reconnaissance images, taken over the Kursk salient in the weeks prior, showing earthworks, minefield indicators, and the unmistakable geometry of prepared defensive positions already under construction. Model places them on the table. He speaks. The conference record, preserved in the war diary of the Oberkommando des Heeres, notes the substance of his presentation. What it does not record, because war diaries do not record such things, is the sound of the room's discomfort. 3 post-war memoirs describe the same conference. 3 different events emerge from them. Heinz Guderian, present at the Berghof in his capacity as Inspector General of Armored Troops, writes in his memoir Panzer Leader that he told Hitler directly that Citadel would fail and that the Panther tanks were nowhere near ready for frontline deployment. The OKH War Diary for the same date records Guderian's concerns about Panther mechanical reliability, but does not record any categorical prediction of the offensive's failure. Manstein, who was not present at the May 3rd conference itself, but who had been advocating for an earlier attack through the preceding weeks, later wrote that the delay was the operative mistake, that the window for success was closing with every week of postponement. And Model, whose photographs had triggered the postponement in the first place, left no known personal account of his private assessment. 3 men, 1 meeting. The historical record fractures into 3 incompatible stories, and I find that fracture more revealing than any of the individual accounts, because it tells you that in the spring of 1943, Germany's senior military commanders were not operating from a shared strategic reality. They were each inside their own version of the war. What they agreed on, at least implicitly, was that something was wrong with the plan. The specific nature of that wrongness was where they diverged. Guderian's position was essentially industrial. The Panzer Force needed to be preserved and rebuilt, not expended in a costly offensive at a salient that had no decisive strategic value, even if captured. He thought Citadel was the wrong battle to fight entirely, regardless of timing. Kluge, commanding Army Group Center and Manstein's counterpart for the northern sector, supported the offensive most energetically, his argument being that waiting was itself a form of strategic surrender, that allowing Soviet power to grow unchecked while Germany hesitated was more dangerous than the risks of the attack itself. Manstein occupied a middle position. Attack, but attack earlier, before the Soviet defenses mature. These 3 positions are not equally valid, and I want to be honest about that. Guderian's industrial argument has the most evidential support when examined against the production records. But Guderian was also the man who, as Inspector General of Armored Troops, had overseen the very tank program, the Panther development, that was simultaneously being used to justify the postponement he opposed. The Panther problem sits at the heart of the May conference and deserves specific examination because it illustrates something important about the relationship between German weapons development and German strategic decision-making. Hitler's primary reason for postponing Citadel from May to July was his desire to have significant numbers of the new Panther Ausf D tanks available for the offensive. The Panther was, in concept, a genuinely formidable vehicle, a response to the shock of encountering the Soviet T-34 in 1941, designed with sloped armor of 75 to 80 millimeters on the front hull, and a long 75 millimeter gun capable of penetrating the T-34 at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Hitler believed the Panther would be a qualitative multiplier that would offset the numerical disadvantages his panzer force was facing. What Guderian knew, and what the Kummersdorf trial reports from March of 1943 documented in clinical detail, was that the Panther's final drive housing was catastrophically underdimensioned for the vehicle's 44-ton weight. It would break. Under operational conditions, it would break predictably and repeatedly. The specific mechanism of the failure matters here, so I'll describe it precisely. The Panther's Zahnradfabrik AK-7200 gearbox transmitted engine power to the drive sprocket through a cast steel final drive housing. That housing had been designed for a vehicle originally specified at approximately 35 tons. When the Panther's weight grew to 44.5 tons through successive armor additions, the housing was never fundamentally redesigned. Under the lateral torque loads generated during cross-country turns, exactly the type of movement required on the broken steppe terrain near Kursk, the housing would crack along stress concentration points at predictable locations in the casting. When the housing cracked, oil escaped, the ring gear ran dry, and seizure followed within roughly 60 to 90 seconds of oil loss. Field repair required complete removal of the final drive unit, 4 to 6 hours under ideal workshop conditions, 8 to 12 hours in a forward position under artillery fire. The production schedule knew about this failure. The Kummersdorf report flagged it. The decision was made to proceed anyway, because stopping production to redesign the housing was assessed as more damaging to the timeline than the failure itself. They built the flaw into the vehicle, noted the flaw, and sent the vehicles to Kursk. It fascinates me, I use that word deliberately, how the Panther situation encapsulates the entire institutional logic of German military planning in the spring of 1943. The desire for qualitative superiority was genuine and understandable. German industry was producing fewer tanks than the Soviet Union. The only available compensatory strategy was to ensure that each German tank was individually more capable than its Soviet counterpart. But the pursuit of qualitative superiority was being executed under production timelines that didn't permit the engineering rigor that quality actually requires. The result was a compromise that satisfied neither criterion. A tank that was qualitatively superior in certain conditions, but mechanically unreliable under the precise operational conditions it was being sent to face. By the time the May 3rd conference concluded with Hitler's decision to postpone Citadel until the Panthers were ready, approximately 200 Panther Ausf D tanks had been ordered to the front. Guderian's inspection teams estimated that close to half of them had unresolved final drive issues. Hitler was waiting for a readiness that the manufacturing process he'd accelerated couldn't deliver. When I was working through the May conference records alongside the subsequent June inspection reports, I kept noticing a specific absence in the documentation. Model had presented his reconnaissance photographs and argued that Soviet defenses were already too mature to allow a clean breakthrough. The conference record notes this. What the record doesn't contain is any sustained engagement with Model's argument at the operational level. Any counter-analysis from OKH or OKW staff showing why the Soviet defensive density Model had photographed was manageable, why the penetration timeline was achievable, why the converging pincers would function as planned, given the disparity in road quality between the northern and southern approaches. The argument against Model's position seems to have been made primarily at the level of will. The offensive must be attempted, therefore the obstacles are surmountable. That is not operational planning, that is something else. By June of 1943, the postponements had accumulated to the point where the operational window that Manstein had been arguing for had definitively closed. The Soviet defensive preparation that Model had photographed in April was now 3 months further along. The Steppe Front Strategic Reserve, 5 additional armies held back from the defensive battle, specifically to be committed at the moment of German exhaustion, was assembled and in position, unknown to German intelligence. The Lucy spy network in Switzerland, the British ultra-intercepts at Bletchley Park, and the agent John Cairncross inside the government code and cipher school had between them provided Moscow with the essential outlines of German operational planning. None of this changed the German decision. On the 1st of July, 1943, Hitler signed the final operational order, confirming that Citadel would begin on the 5th. Manstein would command Army Group South's pincer through the 4th Panzer Army and the Kempf Army detachment. Model would command the 9th Army's northern thrust. Kluge would nominally oversee both. No unified operational command was established to coordinate the converging attack. Each pincer was effectively its own campaign, connected to the other only by the hope that both would succeed simultaneously and meet somewhere near Kursk. They would not. The last meeting before the attack, the final confirmation conference on the 1st of July, left no record of dissent from any of the principals. Guderian had said his piece in May. Modal's photographs had been considered and set aside. Manstein would later write that he still believed the offensive could achieve something, if conducted with sufficient aggression in the south. What none of them recorded, in any document surviving from that period, was a straightforward statement that the strategic objective, encircling and destroying the Soviet forces in the Kursk salient, thereby stabilizing the Eastern Front and regaining the initiative, was achievable by the forces available against the defenses they would encounter. Because they didn't believe it, and yet the orders went out, and the tanks moved to the start lines, and the sapper logbooks recorded mine counts in the dark, and the whole machine prepared to do what institutional momentum, political pressure, and the absence of a viable alternative had made inevitable. Nobody stopped it. Nobody could. The War Diary of the 4th Panzer Army, Hoth's command in the south, contains an entry from late June that I find quietly devastating in its precision. A staff officer has noted, in the standard administrative language of the German military, that rail resupply capacity to the forward assembly areas is operating at maximum capacity, and that any increase in fuel demand beyond planned rates will require diversion of ammunition trains. The fuel and the ammunition were sharing the same railway gauge. There was no margin. The offensive that Germany's senior commanders privately doubted, built on tanks with known mechanical flaws, launched against defenses its own aerial reconnaissance had documented as formidable, would begin with its logistics already at the edge. That's not a post-war judgment. It's in the War Diary, filed before a shot was fired. Chapter 3. What the Soviets Knew, the Intelligence War. Sometime in the spring of 1943, a Soviet military intelligence analyst in Moscow, his name doesn't appear in any declassified document available to Western researchers, received a report from a source in Switzerland. The report described, in considerable operational detail, the German army's intended summer offensive against the Kursk salient, the axis of the southern attack, the forces involved, the approximate timing. The analyst spent the next several days not acting on it. He spent them trying to determine whether it was real. This is, in a sense, the central story of the intelligence picture at Kursk, not the dramatic coup of a super spy delivering plans to a grateful commander, but the grinding, anxious work of a desk analyst, trying to determine which of several partially contradictory intelligence reports deserved to be believed, knowing that the wrong answer in either direction could cost an enormous number of lives. The popular narrative of Soviet intelligence success at Kursk tends to center on a network known as the Lucy Ring, run through a Swiss intermediary and delivering information so precise and so timely that it allegedly gave Moscow near complete foreknowledge of German intentions. This story is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. T.P. Mulligan's 1987 study, published in the Journal of Contemporary History, and based on a close reading of the available primary sources, argues that the Lucy Ring was in significant part a conduit for British ultra-intelligence. Intercepts from the government code and cipher school at Bletchley Park passed deliberately through neutral Switzerland to avoid revealing to Moscow that Britain had broken the German Enigma cipher. The implications of this are considerable. If Mulligan's analysis is correct, then Soviet foreknowledge at Kursk was partly a function of British cryptographic success, not solely Soviet human intelligence work. The Soviet official history has never acknowledged this, and the debate remains unresolved in the primary literature. I'm raising it because it matters, because the institutional story of how the Soviets knew what they knew is more complex and more interesting than the clean spy thriller version. The more direct and more evidentially solid channel was the agent John Cairncross, a British civil servant and Soviet intelligence asset working inside Bletchley Park itself. Cairncross had access to process German signal intelligence in its decrypted form, not the raw cipher traffic, but the finished product, the actual German operational communications. He passed this material to his Soviet handlers through a channel that connected directly to Moscow's Military Intelligence Directorate, the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. thus had access to ultra-derived intelligence in a form that was reliable, timely, and operationally specific. When this was cross-referenced with the Lucy network's material, and with independent Soviet aerial reconnaissance over the Kursk salient, the resulting intelligence picture was sufficiently coherent that Zhukov could write his April 8th memorandum with genuine confidence about the shape of the coming German attack. What the intelligence picture looked like from the receiving end, though, was not a clean brief. It was a mosaic of sources with different reliability ratings, different delays in transmission, and sometimes contradictory specific details. The Harvard Project on the Soviet Social System, an oral history collection assembled in the 1950s from Soviet émigrés, contains an account from a former intelligence analyst, identified only by a pseudonym, who describes receiving a Lucy network report in April of 1943 that gave the precise axis of the German southern pincer attack. He then describes spending 3 days trying to determine whether the report was a German plant. It was almost too precise. That level of detail, in the analyst's experience, was sometimes a signature of a deception operation, the Germans feeding false precision through a known channel. The anxiety is real, and it's professionally justified. The analyst eventually concluded the report was genuine, based on corroborating signals from independent sources. But the corroboration took 3 days. During those 3 days, he sat with a document that might have been either the most valuable intelligence of the war or an elaborate trap, and he could not be certain which. This uncertainty was eventually resolved in the way that good intelligence analysis resolves uncertainty, through accumulation of corroborating evidence from independent sources. By late May of 1943, the convergence of signals intelligence, human intelligence, and aerial reconnaissance had produced a picture that was accurate in its broad operational outlines. Soviet planners knew the attack was coming. They knew the approximate axes. They knew roughly when. What they couldn't be completely certain of was the exact date, and that specific uncertainty had a direct operational consequence. The Soviet counter-battery bombardment that opened the battle in the early hours of the 5th of July was triggered not by a long-range intelligence estimate, but by a captured German prisoner, a sapper from a pioneer battalion, taken while conducting pre-assault mine clearance in no man's land at approximately 0150 hours. He confirmed the attack time under interrogation. The Soviet artillery that disrupted German assembly areas 30 minutes before the German assault began was fired on the basis of that single prisoner's testimony, cross-referenced against everything the intelligence picture had already established. The intelligence system worked, but at the critical final moment, the trigger was a scared man answering questions in a Soviet forward position in the dark. When I first read the Soviet operational record of the July 5th counter-battery bombardment, I was struck by a detail that I hadn't seen foregrounded in any of the major secondary accounts. The fire mission log records the bombardment's target coordinates in precise grid references. These are not defensive registration points, positions calculated to defend against a known approach. They are specific German assembly areas, gun positions, and command posts that Soviet intelligence had identified and mapped over the preceding weeks. The bombardment was, in effect, the kinetic application of the entire preceding intelligence effort. Every agent report, every intercepted signal, every aerial photograph had been converted into a target coordinate. The Soviet intelligence system wasn't just informing defensive preparation, it was generating a fire plan. The transformation from raw intelligence to artillery coordinates is itself an institutional achievement of the first order, and it tends to get lost in the drama of the tank battle that follows. The German intelligence picture of Soviet preparations was, by comparison, a study in the limits of what a competent but systemically disadvantaged intelligence service can achieve. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, had agents reporting on Soviet defensive construction around Kursk throughout May and June of 1943. Several of these reports were accurate in their broad outlines, describing the density of Soviet fortifications and the movement of reserves into the salient. Some of these reports reached OKH. They were, by and large, not acted upon in ways that altered the operational plan. This was partly because the German intelligence system in 1943 was losing the signals intelligence war. Soviet radio discipline had improved dramatically, and German signals interception was generating less actionable intelligence than in previous years. But it was also because the institutional structure of German operational planning in this period had difficulty accommodating unwelcome intelligence, without either dismissing it or restructuring the plan around it. And restructuring the plan was politically impossible. The Maskirovka operation, the Soviet deception and concealment effort that accompanied the defensive preparation, is worth understanding specifically, because it was not simply camouflage. It was a systematic, multi-level deception that operated simultaneously at strategic, operational, and tactical scales. At the strategic level, the existence of the Steppe Front Reserve, 5 armies held behind the defensive battle, was concealed from German intelligence through strict communications security and the use of dummy radio traffic simulating a much smaller and less capable reserve force. At the operational level, false concentration areas were populated with wooden tank decoys and serviced by real truck convoys to create credible visual signatures for German aerial reconnaissance. Photographs taken by Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft in late June of 1943, some of which survive in the Bundesarchiv, show German intelligence analysts assessing these dummy concentrations as genuine force concentrations. They were looking at wood. At the tactical level, actual unit movements were restricted to nighttime hours on routes not visible from standard German reconnaissance flight paths. The entire deception effort was not improvised. It was planned, coordinated, and executed as a distinct operational activity, running in parallel with the physical defensive preparation. There is one aspect of the German intelligence failure that I find genuinely difficult to reconcile with the otherwise high professional standard of Wehrmacht staff work in this period. German aerial reconnaissance over the Kursk salient in May and June of 1943 was producing images of minefield construction, anti-tank ditch excavation, and the steady growth of fortification works across the entire salient perimeter. These images were being analyzed, reports were being written, the reports were reaching operational headquarters, and the operational plan was not being altered. The specific operational question that should have been generated by this intelligence, namely whether the penetration timeline assumed in the Citadel planning was still achievable against the defensive density being photographed, does not appear to have been formally re-examined in any surviving OKH planning document from this period. There was intelligence, there was analysis. There was, apparently, no mechanism by which that analysis could require the operational plan to answer it. That structural inability, the failure of intelligence to compel operational reconsideration, is not a tactical problem. It's an institutional one. By the evening of the 4th of July, 1943, the Soviet intelligence picture was essentially complete. The attack was coming the following morning. The axis was known. The principal forces were identified. The final confirmation had just been provided by a German pioneer soldier who had been sent into no man's land to clear mines before an assault that his side believed was still a secret. Soviet front commanders were notified. The artillery fire plan was finalized. Somewhere in a Moscow office, the analyst who had spent 3 days verifying that April report from Switzerland had long since moved on to other material. The intelligence had done its work. Now the engineering would do its work. And then the guns. Chapter 4. The Engineers' War. Building the Killing Ground. The 14th of June, 1943. Somewhere in the 1st Defensive Belt north of Ponyri, it is raining. A Soviet sapper lieutenant's field logbook, one of several hundred such documents preserved in the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense in Podolsk, records the day's work in 4 lines. Date, mine count, 4,200 PTMI, 42 anti-tank mines installed. Grid references, camouflage, complete, sketches checked. The entry is written in a different hand from the preceding day's entry, possibly a subordinate taking dictation, possibly the lieutenant writing more carefully than usual in the rain. There is no expression of fatigue, no mention of the shells that German aircraft had dropped on the area 3 days earlier, no commentary on what this work is for. There is only the count, the grid, and the notation that the camouflage is complete. This is the voice of the Battle of Kursk's actual outcome. Not a general's dispatch, not a propaganda poster, a lieutenant's logbook in the rain. The scale of what the Soviet engineering effort accomplished between April and July of 1943 is one of those facts that stops feeling real after you've read it a sufficient number of times. More than 500,000 mines, anti-tank and anti-personnel combined, were installed across the Kursk defensive perimeter. Average density on the primary German axes reached 2,400 anti-tank mines per kilometer of front. 8 separate defensive belts were constructed. More than 4,200 kilometers of trenches were dug, and more than 5,000 kilometers of anti-tank ditches were cut to the specification of 3 meters wide and 2 meters deep. Roughly 1.5 million troops were moved into the salient as reinforcement, their movements conducted at night under strict blackout conditions. The total weight of pre-positioned artillery ammunition for the Voronezh and Central fronts combined exceeded approximately 140,000 tons. These numbers are not rhetorical. They are engineering specifications, and they describe a physical structure, not a metaphorical one, built on the Russian steppe over a period of 10 weeks by human beings working with hand tools, draft animals, and the specific motivation of people who had been fighting for their survival since the 22nd of June, 1941. The PTMI-42 anti-tank mine that appears in the sapper's logbook deserves a moment of specific description because the details of its design illuminate both the sophistication and the very human limitations of the Soviet engineering effort. The device weighed 5.5 kilograms. Its pressure plate required between 150 and 200 kilograms of applied force to trigger the firing mechanism, a compression spring assembly that released a striker pin into the detonator cap when the plate was depressed below a threshold. This threshold was deliberately calibrated above the weight of a standing soldier, who might apply perhaps 80 kilograms per square centimeter of boot contact, but well below the distributed ground pressure of a tracked vehicle. The mine's flat cylindrical profile, 32 centimeters in diameter and 9 centimeters in height, allowed it to be installed beneath 4 to 6 centimeters of displaced soil and loose vegetation, where it became essentially invisible to casual inspection. The installation process, however, left a characteristic circular disturbance pattern in the soil surface, a ring of slightly compressed and disturbed earth, roughly 35 centimeters across, that trained German mine detection teams could identify under favorable lighting conditions. The quality of camouflage was therefore not uniform across the 500,000 mines laid. It varied with the skill of the installing unit, the time available, the soil type, and the weather. Some mines were essentially invisible. Some were visible to experienced eyes. The German after-action reports from the first days of Citadel describe both conditions. This is the gap between the engineering specification and the operational reality, and it mattered in specific sectors. The anti-tank ditch program deserves equal attention because its engineering specification was directly calibrated against specific German vehicle characteristics in a way that isn't always recognized. A Tiger I heavy tank, the vehicle the Soviets most needed to stop, had a ground clearance of approximately 47 centimeters and a hull length of 6.5 meters. A correctly dimensioned anti-tank ditch of 3 meters width and 2 meters depth presented the Tiger with an obstacle it physically could not cross under its own power. The Tiger's hull would contact the ditch's far wall at an angle that provided insufficient traction for the drive sprockets, while the rear of the vehicle dropped into the ditch behind the center of gravity. The tank would be immobilized, presenting a static target. The specified ditch dimensions were not arbitrary. They were derived from known German vehicle engineering data, the kind of data that Soviet military intelligence had been systematically collecting since the first encounters with Tiger tanks in the Leningrad area in September of 1942. The Soviets had studied the Tiger's dimensions and built the ditch to fit. The anti-tank strong point, the pack front in Soviet tactical terminology, was the third component of the engineering system, and in some ways the most sophisticated. The concept, developed and refined through the preceding year of fighting, involved the sighting of clusters of 6 to 10 anti-tank guns at mutually supporting positions, with overlapping fields of fire covering a specific zone of ground. The pack front's killing power came not from the individual gun's capability, but from the geometric relationship between positions. Any German tank entering the engagement zone would simultaneously be within the effective range of multiple gun positions firing from different angles. The Soviets positioned their ZIS-3 76mm divisional guns, the standard Soviet anti-tank weapon, not on the frontages facing German approach routes, but on the flanks of those approach routes, where they could engage the side armor of German tanks at ranges of 200 to 400 meters. The ZIS-3 couldn't reliably penetrate the Tiger I's frontal armor of 102 millimeters at normal combat ranges. It could reliably penetrate the Tiger's side armor of 82 millimeters at flank engagement ranges. The pack front converted a gun that couldn't defeat a Tiger from the front into a gun that could defeat it from the side. The minefields, the ditches, and the anti-tank ditches channeled the Tigers into the flanking fire arcs of the guns that were positioned to kill them. The entire system was engineered as an integrated killing machine, each component enhancing the lethality of the others. It fascinates me, and I think it should fascinate anyone who spends time with these engineering records. How thoroughly Soviet defensive planning in 1943 had absorbed the lessons of the preceding 2 years of catastrophic failure. In 1941 and 1942, Soviet defensive lines had been breached repeatedly by German armored thrusts that simply drove through the gaps between fixed positions, exploiting the absence of depth and mobile reserves. By 1943, the Soviet response was architecturally complete. Depth of approximately 300 kilometers, mobile anti-tank reserves positioned behind the fixed belts and capable of rapid redeployment to threatened sectors, and a communications infrastructure, substantially enhanced by American Lend-Lease field telephone equipment, that allowed real-time coordination between observation posts, gun positions, and reserve commanders. The defeated army of 1941 had rebuilt itself not just in numbers, but in doctrine. It had extracted operational lessons from its own disasters and converted them into engineering specifications. The minefields were the physical expression of that institutional learning. When I was working through the U.S. Army's Combat Studies Institute publication on mine and countermine operations at Kursk, a document that makes very dry reading but rewards careful attention, I found a detail that I hadn't encountered in the major secondary histories. Soviet engineers, in laying the minefields across the primary German axes of advance, deliberately included narrow, unmarked lanes at specific intervals. These lanes were not gaps left by incomplete work. They were designed features, known only to specific Soviet tank regiment commanders, and recorded on documents held exclusively at front-level headquarters. Their purpose was not defensive. They were the corridors through which Soviet armor would eventually advance when the Soviets transitioned from defense to counteroffensive. The killing ground that the German tanks were about to enter had already been designed for Soviet tanks to pass through in the opposite direction. The trap had pre-cut exits. The Soviets were building the defensive system and the offensive system simultaneously, in the same piece of ground. The logistics of the mining operation alone represent an achievement that deserves specific acknowledgement before being folded back into the larger narrative. Moving, distributing, and installing 2,766 metric tons of mines, the approximate total weight of the 500,000 PTM I-42 devices and their accompanying anti-personnel complement, across a front measured in hundreds of kilometers, at night, under blackout conditions, without triggering German aerial reconnaissance detection sufficient to alarm OKH planning, required a sustained organizational effort that ran continuously for 10 weeks. The mines arrived by rail to rear area distribution points. They were transferred to horse-drawn wagons for the last stage of distribution. The wagons moved only at night on routes cleared for nighttime traffic. Sapper companies received their allocations by grid reference and worked their assigned sectors in darkness with shielded lanterns, installing to specification and sketching the completed pattern for the regimental records. The officer who signed the sketches was accountable for the accuracy of the installation. The accountability mattered because the sketches would later be used to guide Soviet tank columns through the lanes. An error in the sketch would kill Soviet soldiers. This was not abstract institutional responsibility. It was personal. The sapper lieutenant who recorded "Camouflage complete, sketches checked" on the 14th of June was signing his name to work that would determine whether the men who followed him through his minefield in August would live or die. Soviet anti-tank artillery brigades weren't distributed along the front in the manner of earlier Soviet defensive doctrine, spread evenly to provide uniform coverage, but were instead held as mobile reserves positioned 8 to 15 kilometers behind the forward defensive belt, where they could be rapidly deployed to reinforce threatened sectors after the German attack had revealed its main axis. This required, and this is a point that tends to get overlooked, reliable communications between the observation posts identifying the German Schwerpunkt and the brigade headquarters holding the reserve guns. Without the ability to communicate in real time across the depth of the defensive system, the mobile reserve concept was operationally unworkable. The Lend-Lease field telephones, 241,000 units delivered to the Soviet Union by mid-1943, made that communication possible. The Soviet ability to move anti-tank brigades to the German main effort within 2 to 4 hours of the effort being identified depended directly on wire communications that ran, in significant part, through American-manufactured equipment. The engineering of the killing ground was partly American. By the evening of the 4th of July, 1943, the defensive system was complete in all essential respects. The last mine had been installed. The last sketch had been checked. The anti-tank ditches were cut to specification. The artillery ammunition dumps were positioned and covered. The pack front gun positions were registered. The mobile reserves were in place, with their approach routes cleared. Somewhere in the command network, a Soviet front commander received confirmation that his sector was ready. He filed it. In the logbooks, the work was done. The engineering had given the defenders every advantage that engineering could give. What remained was to wait for the German tanks to arrive, and to do what the engineering had been designed to make inevitable. Chapter 5. The Machine That Broke Itself, Panther and Tiger at Kursk. The 7th of July, 1943. 2 days into Operation Citadel. Somewhere behind the German start line in the southern sector, a regimental records officer is filling out a vehicle status report. The document he's completing, a standard Wehrmacht armored unit returns form, recording operational status by vehicle type, will later be held at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, where it has been examined and cited by historians including Nicholas Setterling and Anders Frankson in their statistical analysis of the Kursk armored engagement. The officer writes the date at the top. Then he writes 3 columns. The first column, vehicles ready for action. The second column, vehicles under short-term repair. The third column, vehicles requiring long-term repair or total losses. For the Panther tank, Germany's most modern armored vehicle, the machine Hitler had delayed the entire offensive to obtain in sufficient numbers. The third column is longer than the first. Among the fault entries in the third column, the records officer writes a phrase that I find, in context, genuinely arresting. Brandschaden, fire damage. And beneath it, in the qualifier column, nicht fein Einwirkung, not caused by enemy action. A Panther tank had caught fire from its own engine. On the second day of the most important German offensive of the war, Germany's most advanced tank was burning itself down. The mechanical crisis of German armor at Kursk is one of those historical facts that appears in most accounts of the battle, but rarely receives the sustained examination it deserves, because it is technically unglamorous, and because it complicates the preferred narrative structures of both sides. German post-war accounts prefer to emphasize tactical competence and strategic mismanagement. Soviet accounts prefer to emphasize numerical superiority and heroic resistance. The proposition that a significant portion of Germany's armored strength at Kursk was effectively destroyed by mechanical failure before it ever encountered Soviet resistance is uncomfortable for both narratives. But the vehicle status reports are unambiguous, and Zetterling and Frankson's analysis, based on a systematic reading of German maintenance records rather than operational reports, is difficult to argue with. The Panthers broke. They broke in quantity. They broke in the specific ways that the pre-production trial reports at Kummersdorf had predicted they would break. And they broke at the worst possible moment, when every available tank was needed, and every broken tank was not only absent from the fighting, but actively clogging the maintenance and recovery system behind the front. The scale of the Panther breakdown in the first 48 hours of Citadel requires specific numbers to be understood properly. 200 Panther Ausf-D tanks had been committed to the southern sector, divided principally between the Panzer Grenadier Division Großdeutschland and a dedicated Panther brigade. By the morning of the 7th of July, approximately 40 Panthers were confirmed under repair, the figure from the regimental returns described above, against approximately 21 confirmed ready for action. The remainder were in various intermediate states. The breakdown causes, as recorded in the maintenance logs, followed a pattern consistent with what the Kummersdorf report had predicted. Final drive failures were the most common single cause, followed by engine overheating. The Maybach HL-230P30 engine ran hot under sustained cross-country movement and gearbox failures. The fire damage entry, the Panther that burned from its own engine, was not unique. Several Panthers were written off to engine fires during the first week of Citadel, the result of oil leaks onto hot exhaust manifolds in an engine compartment that had insufficient ventilation for sustained, high-tempo operation in summer temperatures. The Tiger I's mechanical situation was substantially different, and it's important to distinguish between the two vehicles rather than folding them into a single story of German mechanical failure. The Tiger I, operated by the Schwere Panzerabteilungen, the heavy tank battalions, specifically the 503rd and 505th, had by July of 1943 been in frontline service for approximately 8 months on the Eastern Front. Its crews knew the vehicle's specific failure modes. The Maybach Olvar OG 4012-16B pre-selector gearbox was complex, but by mid-1943, reasonably well understood by trained Tiger crews and maintenance teams. Tiger breakdown rates during Citadel ran at approximately 25 to 30% of available vehicles at any given moment, high by modern standards, but substantially lower than the Panther's rate, and critically, distributed across a much smaller total fleet. Only approximately 134 Tiger I tanks were committed to the entire Citadel operation. The Tiger's operational problem wasn't primarily mechanical, it was tactical. The vehicle's 56-ton combat weight made it uniquely vulnerable to the Soviet mine density, and its 60-kilometer road range on internal fuel was genuinely limiting in an offensive requiring sustained advance. The Ferdinand tank destroyer, 90 vehicles committed to model's Northern Pincer under Schwere Panzerjäger Regiment 656, represents perhaps the most concentrated single lesson in the cost of optimizing one performance parameter at the expense of system-level survivability. The Ferdinand carried an 88mm PaK 43L/71 anti-tank gun, capable of penetrating any Soviet armored vehicle at combat ranges with considerable margin. Its frontal armor of 200mm was effectively invulnerable to Soviet anti-tank gunfire at most engagement ranges. In the narrow performance category of frontal firepower and protection, it was the most capable German vehicle at Kursk by a substantial margin. It had no hull-mounted machine gun. None. Not an oversight, a design choice, made because the vehicle's superstructure left no practical mounting point, and because the Ferdinand was conceived as a long-range tank destroyer that would engage Soviet armor at distances where Soviet infantry couldn't close. That conception proved catastrophically wrong in the confined terrain of the Ponyri sector, where Soviet anti-tank rifle teams and infantry carrying explosive charges approached immobilized or mine-struck Ferdinands from the flanks and rear. Of the 90 Ferdinands that crossed the start line on the 5th of July, 39 were total write-offs within the first week of fighting. Many of these losses were to infantry attack against immobilized vehicles, the consequence of a vehicle with extraordinary firepower and no close-in defense. There's a broader pattern visible in the Ferdinand's failure and in the Panther's mechanical crisis that I think is worth making explicit, because it appears at multiple levels of German armored development in this period. The tendency was to optimize a single performance parameter, armor penetration, frontal protection, firepower, at the expense of system-level robustness. The Ferdinand, maximum firepower, no close defense capability. The Panther, maximum combination of mobility, firepower, and protection, at the cost of mechanical reliability. The Tiger, maximum protection and firepower, at the cost of range, recovery requirements, and logistical demand. Each vehicle was, in its specific performance category, genuinely impressive. Each vehicle's failure mode was the direct consequence of the optimization choices that created its strengths. The T-34 was not optimized for any single parameter. It was optimized for the combination of producibility, operational range, mechanical reliability, and sufficient performance in every other category. It wasn't the best tank at anything. It was good enough at everything. And good enough at everything proved to be the more valuable engineering philosophy in an attritional campaign fought at the scale of the Eastern Front. When I was going through the Zetterling and Frankson analysis, their 1997 work is still, in my view, the most rigorous statistical treatment of the German armored records from Kursk. I found the breakdown figures for the northern sector more striking than those for the south, specifically because Model's Ninth Army had proportionally fewer of the problematic new vehicles. The Ninth Army's armored force was built primarily around Panzer III and Panzer IV variants, with Tiger I tanks from the heavy battalions providing assault support. The Panzer IV Ausf H, the main variant deployed, was a mature vehicle by 1943, its 30mm applique armor bringing frontal protection to approximately 80mm, and its 75mm L/48 gun, capable of defeating the T-34's 45mm sloped frontal armor at ranges up to approximately 1,000 meters. The Ninth Army's mechanical breakdown rate, while not trivial, was lower than the southern sector's rate because it was operating with vehicles that crews and maintenance teams knew how to keep running. The mechanical problem at Kursk was not symmetrically distributed. It was concentrated where the new vehicles were concentrated. It was concentrated, in other words, precisely where Hitler had most wanted his new technology to make a difference. The recovery system, the Bergepanzer units and their supporting workshops, deserves specific mention because the breakdown crisis created a second-order problem that compounded the first. The standard German armored recovery vehicle, available in July of 1943, could not tow a Panther under its own power. Towing a Panther required either another Panther in tow configuration or, for cross-country recovery, two recovery vehicles working in tandem. This meant that every immobilized Panther required a recovery effort that tied up 2 to 4 additional vehicles and their crews for the duration of the operation. The immobilized Panthers were, in many cases, positioned in or near the axis of advance, because they had broken down during the advance, where they blocked supply routes, created obstacles for following vehicles, and occupied the maintenance teams that should have been servicing vehicles with minor, quickly correctable faults. The breakdown cascade generated a logistics cascade. The logistics cascade slowed the advance. The slowed advance gave Soviet defenders additional time to bring up anti-tank reserves. The entire mechanism, from the cracked final drive housing in the Panther's AK-7200 gearbox, to the Soviet anti-tank brigade arriving in position 40 minutes earlier than it would otherwise have done, was a connected chain of consequences that ran directly from the Kummersdorf trial report that had been read, acknowledged, and overridden in March of 1943. The vehicle status report from the 7th of July, the document with the burned Panther and the longer third column, was not filed in isolation. Dozens of similar reports were being completed by records officers across the German armored force on that day and on every subsequent day of the offensive. They flowed up through the command chain to Corps, Army, and Army Group headquarters, where staff officers compiled the aggregate figures into the daily armored strength returns that gave commanders their operational picture. The commanders were reading daily reports that showed their armored strength declining faster than their operational progress warranted. The mathematics didn't favor continued attack, but the operational orders called for continued attack, and so the orders were passed down, and the vehicle status reports continued to show the third column growing. Chapter 6, July 5th, the first hour, 0220 hours, the 5th of July, 1943. In the northern sector of the Kursk salient, somewhere along the frontage of Rokossovsky's central front, a Soviet artillery colonel has just received an order. The order is not defensive. It lists target coordinates, precise grid references identifying German assembly areas, gun positions, and forward command posts that Soviet aerial reconnaissance and intelligence sources had mapped over the preceding weeks. The order specifies a time on target. The colonel has been expecting this order for days. The fire plan was finalized, the ammunition pre-positioned, the gun crews briefed. What he could not have been entirely certain of until 90 minutes ago was whether the intelligence picture was correct, whether the Germans were actually going to attack this morning, at approximately this time, along approximately this axis. The captured pioneer soldier, taken at 0150 while clearing mines in no man's land, had confirmed it. The fire mission log would record the order time as 0220. This is where the battle begins. The Soviet counter-battery bombardment that opened the Battle of Kursk on the morning of the 5th of July has been described, in most popular histories of the battle, in approximately one paragraph. This seems to me a significant compression of one of the most consequential single military decisions of the entire campaign. The decision to fire preemptively, to open the battle with a Soviet artillery strike before the German assault began, was not tactically routine. It required that Soviet front commanders possess sufficient confidence in their intelligence picture to fire into German territory without definitive confirmation that the German attack was imminent. The captured Pioneer gave that confirmation 90 minutes before the German assault was scheduled to begin. In 90 minutes, Soviet artillery groups along the Central Front opened fire with approximately 3,000 guns across the assault frontage. The German forward assembly areas, which had been identified and mapped over weeks of intelligence work, received the first significant fires of the battle. German forward positions began reporting the bombardment to Corps headquarters at 0230 hours. The assault schedule, which had assumed the initiative of surprise, was already disrupted. The disruption in the northern sector was real, but not catastrophic in immediate terms. The Soviet counter-battery fire did not destroy the German assault formations. The assembly areas were large enough that dispersed units absorbed the bombardment with manageable casualties, and the German artillery and Luftwaffe responded within the hour. What the preemptive bombardment did was alter the psychological and operational texture of the assault's opening. The German infantry and tank crews who crossed the start line in the early morning hours of the 5th of July had spent the preceding 90 minutes under artillery fire. They had watched rounds fall on their own positions before they moved. They crossed the start line knowing that the defender knew they were coming. The element of surprise, which Citadel's planning had never seriously expected to achieve against a defender who had been preparing for 3 months, but which German assault doctrine still incorporated as an operating assumption, was formally and definitively absent. In the southern sector, the story was different, and the difference matters for understanding the subsequent course of the battle. The Soviet counter-battery effort in the south, under Vatutin's Voronezh front, was less comprehensive than in Rokossovsky's northern sector. The 4th Panzer Army under Hoth and the assault formations of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the Das Reich, and the Totenkopf divisions, attacked approximately on the original schedule, without the 90-minute disruption that Model's 9th Army had experienced in the north. The SS Corps crossed its start line with its organizational integrity intact, its assault timing preserved, and its armored fist concentrated. In the first hours of the 5th of July in the south, the German attack achieved something that it never achieved in the north: genuine tactical momentum. The Leibstandarte's tank regiment, leading the SS Corps' right axis, pushed into the first Soviet defensive belt before dawn, and began the grinding work of breaching the minefield line under cover of Luftwaffe close air support that was flying in effective density in the early morning darkness. The mechanics of breaching a prepared Soviet minefield in 1943 were, in practice, a specific and costly procedure that the vehicle status reports don't capture adequately. German pioneer detachments, specially trained combat engineers, worked ahead of the advancing tank columns, using a combination of manual prodding, a metal rod pressed into the ground at 45-degree angles every 15 centimeters along the proposed lane, mine detectors, and, when time pressure was acute, simply driving vehicles through suspect ground and accepting the detonations. The prodding technique required 1 pioneer per 50 centimeters of lane width, working at approximately 6 meters per hour under ideal conditions. Under fire, working in darkness on hard-packed clay soil, the rate was lower. Each cleared lane was marked with white tape on short stakes, a system visible enough to guide following vehicles, but easily dislodged by artillery fire, at which point the lane marking disappeared and the engineers had to begin again. The German armored advance through Soviet minefields on the 5th of July was not a fluid movement. It was a series of stops and starts, each stop costing time and each restart costing more pioneers. The ZIS-3 76mm gun, the Soviet standard divisional anti-tank weapon, was doing specific, predictable work in the opening hours of the assault that its technical specifications make comprehensible. Against the Panzer IV Ausf-H, the standard German medium tank of the southern advance, the BR-350B armor-piercing round could penetrate the vehicle's frontal armor of approximately 80 millimeters at ranges up to roughly 500 meters. This meant that ZS-3 guns positioned in direct frontal engagement with advancing Panzer IVs were effective only at relatively close ranges, ranges that the German advance through minefield lanes would, if the pioneers did their work properly, not achieve until the German armor was through the minefield and able to close. But Zis 3 guns positioned on the flanks of the minefield lane, where the approaching Panzer IV presented its side armor of 30 mm, were effective at ranges up to 1,500 meters. The side engagement killed the Panzer IV reliably at twice the range that the frontal engagement could. The minefields and anti-tank ditches weren't just obstacles, they were range-setting devices. They held the German armor at the distances and orientations where the Soviet guns that couldn't kill it from the front could kill it from the side. When I was working through the after-action reports for the 5th of July, I kept returning to a specific detail in the Leibstandarte's divisional war diary that I've not seen highlighted in the secondary literature. The diary entry for the 5th of July notes that the division's assault achieved penetration of the first Soviet defensive belt by approximately 0630 hours, roughly 90 minutes after the assault began. This is treated in the entry as evidence of successful progress, and by the standards of the Soviet defensive density, it was. What the entry also records, in the same paragraph, is that the division's pioneer battalions had suffered their highest single-day casualties of the entire Citadel operation on the 5th of July. Not the 7th, when the fighting was arguably heavier, but the 5th, in the minefield lanes. The soldiers whose work made the armored advance possible were the first to die in the numbers that the vehicle status reports don't record. The Luftwaffe's contribution to the 5th of July deserves specific treatment, because it was genuinely impressive in its sortie numbers and genuinely limited in its operational effect. Approximately 3,359 sorties were flown by German air forces on the 5th of July, in support of Citadel, the largest single-day sortie commitment of the entire operation, requiring maximum aircraft utilization across both the 4th Air Fleet in the south and the supporting formations in the north. Hans Ulrich Rudel's Stuka Squadron, flying the Ju-87G variant, equipped with twin 37mm Flak 18 underwing cannon pods, operated against Soviet tank formations in the initial assault area, claiming multiple kills in the first day's fighting. Rudel was genuinely skilled at this work. His claimed kill record remains contested, but was not fabricated from nothing. But the 3,359 sorties, distributed across a front measured in hundreds of kilometers, produced ground attack concentrations that were locally significant and strategically dilute. The Soviet anti-aircraft gun density, approximately 8 to 10 37mm AA guns per kilometer of front on the primary defensive sectors, was making low-altitude Stuka operations progressively more costly as the day wore on. The Luftwaffe 8 Flieger Corps War Diary for the 5th of July records that 23% of aircraft were grounded due to parts shortages by the 7th. The bill for the maximum effort of the 5th was arriving 2 days later, on schedule. By midday on the 5th of July, the battle's essential character was already established, even if the combatants couldn't fully see it yet. In the north, Model's 9th Army was grinding through the first Soviet defensive belt, at costs that the daily armored strength returns were already beginning to document. The disruption of the pre-dawn counter-battery bombardment had added a delay and a psychological weight that the northern assault never fully shed. In the south, Hoth's forces had made genuine progress through the first belt and were pressing toward the second, with the SS Panzer Corps' leading formations operating at or near the quality level that German armored doctrine, at its best, could achieve. The tanks that worked were working well. The tanks that had broken were already in the third column of the records officer's status report. The minefields were doing what the sapper lieutenant's logbook had, in 4 lines on the 14th of June, committed them to do. And somewhere in Moscow, the Stavka was watching the German assault reveal its axes, confirm, in operational practice, the intelligence picture that Zhukov had acted on 3 months earlier, and was beginning to make the calculations about when to commit what reserves, and where, and to what purpose. The first hour was over. The machine was running. Both machines. And one of them had been designed specifically to destroy the other. Chapter 7. The Grinding North. Model's Impossible Arithmetic. The 6th of July, 1943. Ponyri Station. The name appears on Soviet military maps as a small rectangle surrounded by elevation contour lines, sitting on a slight rise above the surrounding steppe. In peacetime, it was a rail junction of no particular distinction, a place where freight cars were sorted and dispatched, where the station master kept a logbook of arrivals and departures, where the platform was long enough for a provincial train and not much longer. By the morning of the 6th of July, it had become something else entirely. The station building had been converted into a Soviet strongpoint, its brick walls reinforced with sandbags and earth. T-34 turrets, stripped from damaged vehicles and welded into concrete emplacements, covered the approaches from the north and northwest. The anti-tank ditch ran across the station's northern perimeter at the specified 3-meter width and 2-meter depth. German reconnaissance had photographed all of this. Modul's staff had read the photographs. The Ninth Army attacked Ponyri anyway, because Ponyri sat astride the road that led toward the Second Soviet defensive belt, and there was no other road. The Ninth Army's attack into the northern shoulder of the Kursk salient on the 5th and 6th of July was, in operational terms, the story of a force that had been correctly sized for a different defensive problem than the one it actually encountered. Modul commanded approximately 335,000 men and roughly 1,200 tanks and assault guns for the northern pincer, a substantial force by any ordinary measure. Against a normally fortified defensive position, or against the Soviet defensive works of the previous year, these forces would have been formidable. Against 8 prepared defensive belts extending 300 kilometers in depth, with mine densities of 2,400 anti-tank mines per kilometer on the primary approaches, and with mobile anti-tank reserves capable of redeploying to threatened sectors within hours, the Ninth Army was walking into an equation that its numbers could not solve. Model had said as much, privately, before the battle began. His private estimate of 12 kilometers maximum penetration was not pessimism, it was arithmetic. The arithmetic was correct. The daily armored strength returns for the Ninth Army, preserved at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv and examined in detail by Zetterling and Frankson, tell the battle's northern story with a statistical clarity that operational narratives tend to obscure. The pattern begins on the 6th of July and repeats with only minor variations through the 12th. The column marked Einsatzbereit, combat ready, declines by a measurable percentage each day. The column marked Kurzfristig reparierbar, repairable within 24 hours, grows, then stabilizes as repair capacity is saturated. The column marked Langfristig reparierbar oder Totalausfall, long-term repair or total loss, grows without stabilizing. Read as a time series across 7 days, these 3 columns describe not a battle that is making difficult progress, but a battle that is consuming itself. The Ninth Army was losing armored vehicles faster than it was losing defensive belts. By the 9th of July, 4 days into the offensive, Modul's tank strength had declined by approximately 1/3 from its start line figure. His penetration depth was approximately 10 to 12 kilometers. His objective was 100 kilometers. The numbers had never added up, and now the numbers were getting worse. The specific fighting for Ponyri Station deserves more detailed treatment than it typically receives, because it illustrates in concentrated form the nature of the tactical problem facing the entire northern attack. The station changed hands multiple times between the 6th and the 10th of July. German units capturing the station building itself on the 7th, Soviet forces retaking it on the 8th, German forces pushing back in on the 9th. The back and forth over the same 400 meters of ground was not a tactical failure on either side. It was the natural consequence of 2 forces fighting at the intersection of German offensive capability and Soviet defensive density, where neither side had the local superiority to hold permanently, and neither had the operational freedom to disengage. Each exchange of the station building cost both sides men and vehicles. The daily German casualty reports for the units engaged at Ponyri show consistent losses to mines, to the buried T-34 turret pillboxes, and to Soviet artillery, with the artillery accounting for the largest single category of German armored vehicle casualties in this sector. The Ferdinand tank destroyers of Schwere Panzerjäger Regiment 656 were committed to the Ponyri sector, specifically because the Ferdinand's 200mm frontal armor and 88mm gun made it the most capable anti-fortification weapon available to the Ninth Army. The logic was sound in isolation. A vehicle that Soviet anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate from the front, equipped with a gun that could destroy any Soviet emplacement at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters, seemed ideally suited to cracking the Ponyri fortifications. What the logic failed to account for was the mine density, and the absence of a whole machine gun. Ferdinands that struck mines, and the mine density in the Ponyri approach corridors was among the highest on the entire Kursk front, were immobilized and then systematically destroyed by Soviet infantry teams who approached from the flanks and rear. An anti-tank rifle round against the rear armor of a Ferdinand was effective. A satchel charge placed beneath the rear deck was definitive. The Ferdinand that couldn't be killed from the front was being killed from below, by soldiers who had crossed a minefield on foot to reach it. Of the 90 Ferdinands that began the battle, the operational totals by the battle's end showed 39 as complete write-offs. A significant portion of those losses were to infantry attack against immobilized vehicles. A vehicle optimized for long-range tank killing had been defeated by men carrying explosives. I find Modal's situation in the northern sector genuinely difficult to analyze without a degree of sympathy that I want to be careful not to let distort the historical judgment. He was, by the evidence, one of the few senior German commanders who had clearly perceived before the battle began that the objective was unachievable with the forces available. His aerial reconnaissance photographs, presented at the May 3rd conference, had documented the Soviet defensive maturation with accuracy. His private estimate of 12 kilometers maximum penetration had proved in the event essentially correct. The Ninth Army reached approximately that depth and stopped, and no subsequent effort meaningfully extended it. Yet the war diary entries for Modal's headquarters during the battle become progressively terse and administrative, almost deliberately devoid of operational commentary. The man who had argued most clearly against the offensive's viability left the least documentary trace of his private response to watching his prediction confirmed in blood. Whether this was professional discipline, political caution, or something more complex is not recoverable from the documents. What is recoverable is the outcome: 12 kilometers. That was all. When I was cross-referencing Modal's 9th Army after-action reports against the Soviet Central Front operational records for the same period, I found a specific discrepancy that I think is worth flagging explicitly, because it illustrates how differently the two sides were measuring the same battle. The Soviet operational account describes the 9th Army as effectively halted by the 8th of July, 3 days into the offensive. German unit diaries show continued tactical actions, local advances, and genuine fighting through the 10th and 11th of July in several sectors. The truth, as Zetterling's analysis establishes through a careful reading of both sets of records, is that both descriptions are technically accurate and operationally misleading when taken alone. The 9th Army was not halted in the physical sense of ceasing to fight on the 8th of July. It was operationally exhausted in the sense that had lost the momentum required to achieve a strategic breakthrough. These are different conditions, and conflating them has produced decades of confusion about the northern sector's timeline. A force can be simultaneously fighting and strategically finished. The 9th Army was both. The Soviet response to the 9th Army's advance demonstrated, with operational clarity, the system that the 3 months of defensive preparation had been designed to produce. As German armored thrusts identified their main axes, the Ponyri corridor, the approaches toward Prokhorovka, Soviet anti-tank reserve brigades were moved to reinforce those axes within hours of the German directions becoming clear. The communications infrastructure that made this redeployment possible, the wire networks running through Lend-Lease field telephone equipment, was functioning at the pace the defensive doctrine required. A German tank regiment pushing toward Prokhorovka would find the anti-tank gun density ahead of it increasing rather than thinning, because the Soviet reserve system was feeding guns toward the identified threat faster than the German advance was depleting them. This was the operational logic of the 8 defensive belts made actual. Not that each belt would stop the Germans definitively, but that the time required to breach each belt would allow the next belt to be reinforced. The Germans were operating against a defense that got thicker the deeper they pushed into it. By the 10th of July, 5 days into the offensive, Modal had effectively exhausted his operational reserves. The divisions he had held back for exploitation, the armored formations intended to drive through any breakthrough his assault divisions achieved, had been committed to plugging gaps and reinforcing stalled attacks rather than exploiting success, because the assault divisions hadn't achieved the kind of breakthrough that exploitation forces are designed to use. The northern pincer was no longer a penetration force with a strategic objective. It was a collection of engaged divisions fighting for tactical positions that had no strategic value in the absence of a linked advance from the south. The 100-kilometer objective, Kursk City, the junction point with Hoth's southern forces, was as far away on the 10th of July as it had been on the 5th. Further, in operational terms, because the Ninth Army had consumed a third of its armored strength to cover 12 kilometers. The 12th of July brought the northern sector's situation to its defining moment. At 0330 hours that morning, 3 Soviet fronts, the western, the Bryansk, and the central, attacked the German-held Orel salient to the north of the Citadel battlefield. This was Operation Kutuzov, which had been planned and prepared in parallel with the Kursk defensive battle. Its Stavka directive issued on the 20th of June, 15 days before Citadel began. The Ninth Army, already engaged on its southern front and already below the armored strength required to achieve its original objective, now found itself simultaneously attacked from the north and east. Divisions that had been fighting southward were needed northward. The operational geometry had inverted. Model's force, which had entered the battle as an offensive formation with a strategic objective, was now a defensive formation, fighting to preserve its own positions against a Soviet counteroffensive it had not anticipated. The battle diary entries from this period are, in their administrative terseness, among the most quietly devastating documents in the entire Kursk archive. 0400 hours, the 12th of July, 1943. Somewhere in the Ninth Army's operational map room, a staff officer is updating the daily position overlay. The front line has barely moved in 3 days. The armored strength return shows numbers that are getting worse, not better. And from the north, from the direction of the Orel salient that Model's forces had been holding since 1941, the signals traffic is beginning to describe artillery impacts and infantry contact. The arithmetic that Model had calculated in private before the battle began has, in the most complete possible way, proved correct. 12 kilometers. That was the northern pincer's total achievement. In the logbooks, the third column kept growing, and nobody in the map room was filling in the objective box on the operational overlay, because the objective was 100 kilometers away, in a direction the Ninth Army was no longer moving. Chapter 8. The Letters That Weren't Sent. Somewhere near Ponyri, the 7th of July, 1943. The artillery has been more or less continuous for 2 days. A Soviet rifleman, his name doesn't appear in the regimental records from this sector. The regimental records show casualties by unit and type, but rarely by individual name below officer rank, has found a few minutes in which the immediate task is waiting rather than acting. He takes out the triangular field postcard that Soviet soldiers were issued in lieu of envelopes. The format was standardized deliberately, a single sheet, folded into a triangle and sealed with a torn edge rather than an envelope flap, so that the military censor could read it without opening it. He writes to his mother in Saratov. What he writes is short. It is short because the format encourages brevity, and because there is, in certain extremities, very little that words can carry. The card was found in a chest pocket. It was never sent. The Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow holds documents of this type in considerable quantity, and their collective weight, the sum of what was written and never delivered, is one of the truest records of what Kursk actually cost. The Battle of Kursk consumed human beings at a rate that its operational success and its mythologization as a strategic turning point consistently obscures. The standard figures, 6,000 tanks, 2 million men, 4,000 aircraft, are, I think, a form of abstraction that the scale of the numbers makes almost inevitable. They are too large to feel like what they are. Each unit a person, or a machine operated by a person, or a shell fired at a person. The Soviet defensive phase of the battle, from the 5th to the 23rd of July, produced casualties that the post-war historiographical record has revised substantially since the Cold War ended. Soviet official figures published before 1991 claimed approximately 177,000 casualties for the defensive phase. Post-archival research by David Glantz, working from files that became accessible after 1991, suggests a total closer to 685,000 casualties across the full battle, defensive and counteroffensive phases combined. The gap between those two figures is not a rounding error. It is the deliberate management of national historical memory. And somewhere inside that gap are the unanswered postcards. The experience of the Soviet rifle divisions holding the first defensive belt deserves its own attention, because those divisions absorbed the weight of the German armored assault directly and held it, a fact that tends to be overshadowed by the more photogenic story of the tank battles. The 1st Guards Army and the 13th Army on the Central Front had their forward regiments in contact with German armor and infantry from the first hours of the 5th of July. Casualty rates in forward regiments in the hardest-hit sectors reached 60 to 70% within the first 3 days. This figure requires a moment's consideration. 60 to 70% casualties means that more than half the men in a given regiment were dead, wounded, or missing within 72 hours of the battle's opening. The regiments didn't break. They held the defensive positions that the engineers had built, fought behind the minefields that the sappers had laid, and absorbed the armored assaults that the German operational planning had assumed would break through within a day or two. The specific detail that I keep returning to in the Soviet medical records from this period is the wound taxonomy. The most common wound type recorded in the frontline surgical battalions during the first week of July is not a gunshot wound. It is fragment wound, multiple, the signature of artillery airburst fire, which the Germans were using extensively against Soviet infantry positions. The second most common is burn injuries, consistent with tank crew casualties. The men holding the line were dying primarily from artillery, not from direct tank contact. The German armored advance was preceded by and supported with artillery fires that the Soviet infantry had to absorb while staying in their positions. They did. Soviet military medicine in 1943 was in a substantially different condition than it had been in 1941, and the difference is visible in the operational records. The pre-positioned medical supplies for the Kursk defensive operation included approximately 78,000 units of blood plasma and more than 4 million bandages across the Voronezh and Central fronts. Surgical battalions had been positioned and staffed in anticipation of the casualty rates that the defensive plan assumed Soviet forces would suffer. The planning for Soviet medical support at Kursk was, in its own way, as revealing as the planning for the minefields. It tells you that the Soviet command understood with clear eyes how many of their own soldiers would be wounded or killed while the German offensive spent itself, and proceeded with the plan anyway. The medical logistics were the acknowledgement, in supply terms, of the human cost that had been deliberately accepted as the price of strategic advantage. A German Panzer IV crewman, his account appears in a post-war German veteran memoir held in the Bundesarchive's collection of personal papers, wrote a letter to his family during a rest period sometime in the first week of July that was completed and sent, unlike the Soviet postcard from Ponyri. The published extract describes watching a comrade's tank strike a mine on the approach to a Soviet strongpoint. He writes, "The left track just lifted. The tank wasn't moving anymore. They waited. There was no fire, no explosion beyond the initial detonation. The tank simply sat there in the steppe grass, its left track blown back and off the drive sprocket, going nowhere." He writes that they weren't sure, at first, whether the crew was alive. There is something in this description, the absence of fire, the stillness, the uncertainty, that says more about the texture of mine warfare than any technical specification can. The mine doesn't announce itself with drama. It just stops a machine. The crew inside either survives or doesn't, and from outside you can't tell which until something moves. To me, the most affecting documents in the entire Kursk archive are not the operational orders or the divisional war diaries. They are the German Infantry Division daily reports from the sectors adjacent to the armored spearheads, covering the nights of the 5th through the 10th of July. These reports describe not dramatic combat but sustained attrition, sniper fire from Soviet positions that the infantry couldn't locate, intermittent artillery harassment that never quite rose to the level of a full fire mission, but never fully stopped either. The psychological wearing of men in forward positions, who had been under fire continuously for 4 or 5 days, without the offensive's anticipated breakthrough materializing to justify what they were enduring. The soldiers in these reports are not the men of the armored spearheads. They are the infantrymen who were supposed to follow the tanks through the gaps that the tanks were supposed to make. The gaps weren't being made at the pace the plan required, and the infantry was paying the price of waiting in exposed positions for an exploitation that kept not arriving. The NKVD barrier troops positioned behind the Soviet forward defensive belt are a detail that appears in the political officer reports from the Central and Voronezh fronts, but rarely in the popular histories of the battle. Their presence was not symbolic. Stalin's Order 227, issued in July of 1942, the not one step back directive, had established barrier detachments as a formal institutional mechanism for preventing unauthorized retreat. By July of 1943, the barrier troop system was well established and understood at every level of the Soviet command. The soldiers holding the mined, ditched, fortified positions of the First Defensive Belt knew with certainty that retreat without orders was not an available option. The military organizational system had been specifically designed to ensure that they stayed. This is not something that appears on the heroic memorial plaques at Prokhorovka or in the official histories of the battle's defensive phase. It is, however, a fact, and it changes the meaning of the endurance of the Soviet forward units in a way that the simpler narrative of patriotic courage alone cannot fully capture. They were brave. They were also given no choice. Both things can be true simultaneously, and the honest history of Kursk requires holding both. When I sat with the Soviet medical records and the German unit diaries from the first week of July and tried to construct a picture of what the battle felt like from inside it, not strategically, not operationally, but from the position of a specific human being in a specific place at a specific time, what struck me most was the ordinariness of the records. The medical logs record wound types and treatment protocols. The unit diaries record positions held and casualties sustained and ammunition expenditure. They do not record despair or exaltation or the specific quality of fear that comes from knowing that the large machine you're sitting inside has just driven over something that was designed to destroy it. The administrative language of military records is a form of compression that makes the events they describe legible but not felt. The postcard from Ponyri, "The noise is very large, I think of the river," is felt precisely because it isn't administrative. It's a person talking, in the format they were given, about what they can reach toward with words in the time they have. The German casualty figures for the northern sector through the 12th of July are, in their own way, a compressed record of what the mines and artillery and buried tank turrets and pack-front gun clusters had accomplished. German total casualties for the Citadel offensive, both sectors, all branches, have been estimated at between 54,000 and approximately 200,000, depending on the source and the date range used. The lower figures, which appear in some post-war German accounts, cover only the Citadel phase before the counteroffensive began. The higher figures include losses through the end of July and into August as the front stabilized. What the casualty figures cannot show, and what the postcard from Ponyri does show in 4 words, is what those numbers were made of. Each number was a person who, in the days before the 5th of July, had found a few minutes in which the immediate task was waiting rather than acting, and had used those minutes to write something down. The Soviet field postal system processed an estimated 3 million letters and cards per month across the entire Eastern Front in the summer of 1943. The triangular format field postcard, the censorship by design format that required no envelope, was the most common single document type in that flow. They arrived in villages and cities across the Soviet Union in quantities that the postal infrastructure had been specifically restructured to handle. They were read by mothers and wives and children who had learned to decode the institutional language of the format, to understand that "I am well" might mean many things, that "the noise is very large" was as close as the format permitted to truth, and that the card's arrival meant the person who had written it was alive at the moment of writing, which was the information that mattered most. The ones that didn't arrive, the ones still folded in chest pockets in the grass near Ponyri, were a different kind of message, also the most honest kind. Chapter 9. Hoth's Gamble, The Southern Sword. The 9th of July, 1943, somewhere in the 4th Panzer Army's operational headquarters, a map overlay is being updated. The overlay shows the advance of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the Das Reich, and the Totenkopf divisions, over the 4 preceding days of fighting. The advance is real. 25 to 30 kilometers of Soviet defensive territory penetrated, 3 defensive belts partially or fully breached, the approach corridors toward the town of Oboyan contested and in places controlled. By the standards of what Model's 9th Army had achieved in the north over the same period, this is a significantly better operational performance. The SS Corps had fought well and driven hard. General Hermann Hoth, commanding the 4th Panzer Army, was not looking at the overlay with satisfaction. He was looking at it with the specific concern of a commander who has achieved more than he expected on one axis and is now trying to understand what that achievement means in the context of an operation whose strategic premise is increasingly difficult to sustain. To the northeast, beyond the range of his current advance, Soviet armored reserves were massing. Hoth wrote a single word in his own hand against the timetable column of the Army's daily operations summary. Unmöglich. Impossible. Hoth's redirection of the SS Panzer Corps eastward toward Prokhorovka, the decision that would produce the most famous single day of the battle, has been interpreted in the post-war literature through several conflicting lenses, and the conflict between them is worth examining directly before moving to the events themselves. Manstein's memoir characterizes the eastward turn as an operational deviation that sacrificed the southern pincer's last opportunity to drive toward Kursk. German post-war historiography has generally followed Manstein in this framing, treating the Prokhorovka engagement as a detour that cost Citadel its remaining momentum. Hoth's own post-battle analysis argues the opposite, that the Soviet Fifth Guards tank army was concentrating northeast of the current axis of advance, that engaging it frontally on ground of German choosing was preferable to allowing it to strike the SS Corps' exposed eastern flank during a northward drive, and that the eastward reorientation was therefore a necessary preparatory operation rather than an abandonment of the original objective. The contemporary signals intelligence records, examined by Zetterling, confirm that the Fifth Guards tank army was indeed moving toward the Prokhorovka area in early July. On this specific evidential point, Hoth's operational logic is more supported by the documentary record than Manstein's criticism of it. But there is a more fundamental problem with the entire debate, which is that it assumes a version of the Southern Offensive's strategic situation that the evidence doesn't support. By the 9th of July, whether Hoth turned east toward Prokhorovka or continued north toward Oboyan and Kursk, the 4th Panzer Army was operating inside a strategic context that had already closed off the possibility of achieving Citadel's stated objective. The northern pincer was stalled at 12 kilometers of penetration depth, the junction that would complete the encirclement. The meeting of Hoth's forces with Modul's forces somewhere near Kursk required both pincers to advance approximately 80 kilometers beyond their current positions simultaneously. The northern pincer had demonstrated conclusively that it couldn't advance another 80 kilometers. The southern pincer, however well it performed tactically, could not complete an encirclement by itself. The Unmöglich that Hoth wrote against the timetable wasn't about Prokhorovka versus Oboyan. It was about the fundamental geometry of an operation whose other half had already failed. The tactical situation of the SS Panzer Corps in the days preceding Prokhorovka requires specific description, because the popular mythology of the battle tends to compress the approach into a few sentences before arriving at the climactic 12th of July. The reality is that the Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions had been fighting continuously since the 5th of July, 4 days of sustained armored combat through successive Soviet defensive belts, with the attendant mechanical breakdowns, ammunition consumption, fuel demands, and casualty accumulation that sustained armored combat produces. The Leibstandarte's tank strength on the 9th of July was significantly below its start line figure. The specific numbers vary between sources, and I want to be careful not to cite a figure with more precision than the available records support, but the operational pattern is clear. The corps that would fight at Prokhorovka on the 12th of July was not the corps that had crossed the start line on the 5th. It was the same formation, with the same commanders and the same organizational structure, but it had been reduced by 4 days of the most intense armored fighting on the Eastern Front. The Soviet side of the Prokhorovka approach is equally important and equally under-examined in the popular accounts. General Pavel Rotmistrov's Fifth Guards Tank Army had been moving toward the Prokhorovka area under Stavka orders issued following the German advance's identification of its main axis. Rotmistrov received his operational orders for the 12th of July on the 11th. He was to attack the SS Panzer Corps at dawn, hitting the German force before it could reorganize and resume its advance. The orders were specific about timing and axis. What Rotmistrov's own post-battle report to Vasilevsky acknowledges, in language that his published memoir subsequently soft-pedals significantly, was that the Fifth Guards Tank Army was committed to the attack without adequate reconnaissance of the terrain between its assembly areas and the German positions. This is a serious operational failure, and it belongs in the account of Prokhorovka's outcome. The army that attacked on the 12th of July was advancing into ground it hadn't fully mapped, against a force whose precise positions and strength it didn't fully know. Hoth's supply situation by the 9th of July was operating at the absolute margin of what the logistics system could sustain, and this constraint shaped his operational choices more directly than any operational map consideration. The 4th Panzer Army's daily fuel consumption during the Citadel offensive ran at approximately 800 cubic meters of diesel and petrol per day, a figure that required a continuous supply column of approximately 200 3-ton trucks running from the railheads at Belgorod and Kharkov to the forward fuel distribution points. The rail capacity supporting the southern assault was functioning at maximum capacity, with fuel trains and ammunition trains sharing the same gauge. Soviet partisan operations against the rail lines in the Army Group South rear area had forced several rerouting actions during the first week of July, adding distance and delay to the supply cycle. The SS Corps was fighting on a logistics margin that had no buffer. Any interruption to the supply chain, additional partisan damage, Luftwaffe losses reducing air resupply capability, Soviet artillery finding a fuel dump, would have ended the southern advance independently of what Soviet armor did to it. The Great Tank Army, whose progress was being mapped with German precision at Army headquarters, was running on fuel reserves measured in hours rather than days. The Panzer IV Ausf H tanks that formed the operational core of the SS Corps's armored strength, 58 in the Leibstandard alone at the campaign's start, were, by any technical measure, effective weapons against the T-34 variants they were encountering. The Ausf H's 75mm L-48 gun could defeat the T-34's 45mm sloped frontal armor at ranges up to approximately 1,500 meters. Its own frontal hull armor of approximately 80mm, combined with an applique plate on the lower front hull, was proof against the Soviet 76mm ZS-3 at ranges beyond roughly 500 meters. In open steppe terrain, at engagement ranges of 800 to 1,200 meters, the Panzer IV Ausf H held a genuine qualitative advantage over the T-34 Model 1943. This is why the SS Corps made progress when it could fight in the conditions its doctrine and equipment favored. Open ground, good visibility, engagement ranges where its optics and gun performance were superior. The mine-channeled approaches, the artillery concentrations, and the pack-front gun positions were specifically designed to prevent those conditions from arising. When they arose anyway, when the SS Corps broke into open ground between defensive belts, the exchange ratios favored the Germans. Those moments were real, and the dismissive post-Cold War historiography that treats the SS Corps's tactical performance as inconsequential is not supported by the records. When I was working through the 4th Panzer Army War Diary entries for the period from the 7th to the 11th of July, I kept noticing a quality in the operational language that I think the secondary literature tends to miss. The entries from the 7th and 8th are written with a precision and forward-looking confidence that reflects genuine tactical momentum. They record positions reached, objectives secured, next day's axis of advance. By the 9th and 10th, the language begins to shift. The forward-looking confidence gives way to a more defensive framing. Positions to be consolidated, flanks to be secured, reserves to be held rather than committed. The word consolidation appears with increasing frequency. This is not the language of an offensive that believes it has a strategic objective within reach. It's the language of an offensive that is managing its accumulated costs while maintaining the appearance of forward momentum. Hoth had written unmöglich against the timetable in his own hand. His staff was writing consolidation in the daily entries. Both were saying the same thing in different registers. The 11th of July, wrote Mistrov receives his orders for the following morning's attack. Somewhere in the 5th Guards Tank Army's assembly areas northeast of Prokhorovka, tank crews are performing maintenance checks, refueling from the forward supply points, loading ammunition racks, and receiving their orders for the morning through the command chain. They have been told they are to attack at dawn. They have been told the direction. They have not been told, because no one has established with certainty, what precisely they will find when they get there. How many German tanks, positioned exactly where, with what anti-tank support. The reconnaissance had been insufficient. The army was going in partially blind. In the Leibstandart's positions to the southwest, German tank crews are doing the same tasks: maintenance, refueling, ammunition loading. They have been told to consolidate and prepare for continued operations. They have not been told that an entire Soviet tank army is assembling in the darkness to their northeast. Both sides will meet in the morning at a place that will become, in the historical mythology, the definitive moment of the Battle of Kursk. In the operational reality, it will be something considerably more complicated. Chapter 10. Prokhorovka. Dismantling the Myth. The 12th of July, 1943, 0830 hours. Southwest of the village of Prokhorovka, the morning light is already hard and bright in the way that the Russian steppe produces in midsummer. Flat light with no softening haze, the kind that makes distances deceptive and silhouettes sharp. The ground between the Soviet assembly areas and the German positions is rolling open farmland, the grain already tall in the fields that haven't been churned by the preceding week's fighting. General Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army has begun to advance. 850 tanks in the broad operational figure. The precise number varies by a few dozen, depending on which unit returns you're reading, are moving southwest in the general direction of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler's positions. In the post-war historical mythology, what is about to happen will be described as the greatest tank battle in history. 1,200 to 2,000 tanks clashing at close range in an armored apocalypse that shattered the German armored fist. 2 documents sit in the archive. One was written the day after the battle. One was written 17 years later. Only one of them is honest about the numbers. 2 documents, both written by the same man. The first, Rotmistrov's operational report to Vatutin and Vasilevsky, dated the 13th of July, 1943, preserved in the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense in Podolsk. This document records the 5th Guards Tank Army's losses for the 12th of July, with the administrative precision of a military officer filing required paperwork. The 29th Tank Corps lost 159 tanks. The 18th Tank Corps lost 81 tanks. The Leibstandarte's losses, per the German records examined by Zetterling and Frankson, were approximately 19 tanks, though some of these were likely recoverable rather than total losses. The second document, Rotmistrov's memoir, Steel Guard, published in 1960, describes the same battle as a heroic Soviet triumph that shattered the strike force of the fascist grouping and marked a decisive turning point. The operational report and the memoir are, on the question of what happened on the 12th of July, not compatible accounts of the same event. The operational report is a contemporary record filed by a professional soldier who knew the numbers. The memoir is a political document filed by a Soviet general who had survived a commission of inquiry about those same numbers and understood perfectly well what the official memory of the battle was required to contain. The Commission of Inquiry is itself one of the Prokhorovka story's most important and least examined elements. In late July of 1943, Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky conducted a formal review of the 5th Guards Tank Army's performance at Prokhorovka, specifically examining the catastrophic loss rate on the 12th of July. The inquiry was, in a Soviet military context, a serious matter, the kind of proceeding that had ended careers and, in an earlier period, ended lives. Rotmistrov's defense was essentially the argument that saved him. His mission was not to defeat German armor in a tank-for-tank engagement. His mission was to stop the German offensive. The 5th Guards Tank Army's attack on the 12th of July stopped the Leibstandarte from resuming its northward advance. Therefore, the mission was accomplished. Vasilevsky accepted this argument and recommended no disciplinary action. This distinction between tactical loss and strategic objective achievement is the analytical key to Prokhorovka, and it's the most important single concept in the entire series. The battle was, simultaneously, a Soviet tactical failure and a Soviet strategic success. Both are true. The mythology chose one. The archive contains both. Why did the 5th Guards Tank Army suffer such disproportionate casualties on the 12th of July? The answer is partly in the terrain, partly in the equipment comparison, and partly in the tactical situation that Rotmistrov's operational report frankly acknowledges: insufficient reconnaissance. The ground between the Soviet assembly areas and the German positions included a stretch of open farmland, approached through a corridor between the Psel River on the north and a railway embankment on the south. This corridor was approximately 2 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. 850 Soviet tanks were attempting to advance through a 2-kilometer corridor toward German positions that had been occupied and prepared for several days. The corridor didn't allow for tactical dispersion. The tanks were channeled. The Leibstandartes tank crews, fighting from positions they had had time to select and register, were engaging Soviet armor crossing open ground in good visibility conditions, at ranges that favored their optics. The Tiger 1s of the Leibstandartes Heavy Company were engaging T-34s at ranges of 1,000 to 1,500 meters, within the Tiger's effective engagement envelope and well beyond the range at which the T-34's gun could reliably penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor. The T-34 crew's standard response to Tiger armor advantage was to close the range rapidly to 400 to 600 meters, where the BR-350B round could penetrate the Tiger's side armor. The corridor didn't give them room to execute this tactic effectively. The Zeiss TZF-9B binocular sight, fitted to the Tiger 1, and the improved TZF-12, fitted to later Panzer IV variants, provided 2.5 power magnification with a 23-degree field of view, enabling accurate first-round fire against a moving target at 1,500 to 2,000 meters under favorable conditions. The T-34, Model 1943's TMFD-7 sight, provided comparable magnification but inferior reticle calibration and less precise elevation controls, making reliable first-round hits against German armor at ranges beyond 800 meters significantly more difficult. Soviet tank tactics compensated for this optical disadvantage by closing range aggressively, accepting the risk of crossing the intervening ground under German fire. At Prokhorovka, the corridor between the river and the embankment forced exactly this approach. T-34s crossing open ground at the range band where German optical superiority was most pronounced, before they could close to the range where their gun penetration advantage compensated for the optical deficit. The tactical outcome was determined in significant part by the geometry of the approach route and the limitations of the reconnaissance that should have identified this problem before the attack was ordered. It would be easy to end the Prokhorovka analysis here and draw the obvious conclusion: Soviet tactical failure, German tactical victory. But the Dupuy Institute's analysis of the engagement cautions against this, and I think the caution is warranted. The Leibstandartes tank strength on the evening of the 12th of July was lower than it had been that morning, not higher. The division had repelled the Soviet attack and inflicted severe losses, but it had not been able to advance. It was consolidating. Its operational momentum, already compromised by 4 days of sustained combat and supply line pressure, had not been restored by the engagement. The German after-action reports from the 12th record the day as a defensive success. The Corps held its positions and destroyed Soviet armor at favorable exchange ratios, but they also record the exhaustion and supply shortages that made resuming offensive operations in the immediate term impractical. The tactical winners were also operationally spent. The Soviet army that had taken catastrophic losses had stopped an offensive that could not afford to be stopped. These facts coexist, and the history that presents only one of them is incomplete. There's a moment in Rotmistrov's post-battle report to Vasilevsky that I find genuinely significant, and that doesn't appear in any of the popular accounts of Prokhorovka that I'm aware of. In the section where Rotmistrov describes the operational preparation for the 12th of July attack, he includes a passage criticizing the reconnaissance available to his army before the assault. He writes, and this is reconstructed from the documented substance of the report, not a verbatim quotation, that his army was committed to the attack without adequate information about the terrain between its assembly areas and the German positions, and that he attributed this failure to his superior headquarters. He was, in a formal military report written while the battle was still ongoing and his own career was in serious jeopardy, criticizing the planning process that had sent his tanks into a 2-kilometer corridor without adequately mapping what was at the other end of it. This is not the voice of a heroic commander celebrating a great victory. It's the voice of a professional soldier identifying an institutional failure that had cost his formation 240 tanks in a single day. The revisionist historiography of Prokhorovka, the work that began in the early 1990s when Soviet archives became accessible, and that has been advanced most rigorously by Valery Zamulin's analysis using those archives, has substantially corrected the mythological account, but the correction has not fully penetrated the popular understanding of the battle. In Russia specifically, the process of correction has been uneven. The post-Soviet archival openings that allowed Zamulin's work were a product of the 1990s political environment, and the subsequent tightening of archive access since approximately 2014 has slowed further revisionary scholarship. The Prokhorovka Battlefield Memorial Complex, which was substantially expanded in the 1990s and 2000s, continues to present an account of the battle that emphasizes the scale and heroism of the Soviet effort, without fully incorporating the casualty figures that the archives document. The gap between the memorial and the archive is not accidental. It is a policy choice about which version of the past a national community requires. That choice is understandable in human terms and problematic in historical ones. The 12th of July ended with the field southwest of Prokhorovka holding somewhere between 400 and 500 destroyed or heavily damaged tanks from both sides. Soviet losses vastly exceeding German losses in number, if not in operational significance. The village of Prokhorovka itself was not in German hands. The SS Corps had not advanced. The strategic situation had not changed in any way that favored the German position. It had, if anything, clarified further the operational reality that had been visible in Hoth's war diary since the 9th. The battle that the mythology would later call the turning point of the war was, on the day of its occurrence, experienced by its participants primarily as a day of extraordinary violence with an inconclusive tactical outcome. The German commanders knew they had repelled a major Soviet attack. The Soviet commanders knew they had stopped the German advance. The operational diaries on both sides returned to their standard administrative language by evening. In the morning, there would be more daily strength returns to file, more columns to fill in. The first and second and third columns, whose changing ratios told the story that the operational narratives couldn't quite bring themselves to state plainly. Chapter 11. The War in the Air. Stalemate at Altitude Zero. 500 hours, the 5th of July, 1943. On a Luftwaffe forward operating field, somewhere in the Army Group South rear area, the ground crews have been working since midnight. The aircraft lined along the dispersal areas are Junkers Ju-87G Stukas, the anti-tank variant, fitted with twin 37mm Flak 18 cannon pods underslung beneath each wing, and Focke-Wulf 190F ground attack variants, their engine cowlings still warm from yesterday's maintenance checks. The fuel Bowsers are completing their last rounds. The armorers are lifting the final ammunition loads. In the 8th Flieger Corps War Diary, the sortie plan for the 5th of July has been entered in the standard format: assigned targets, assigned aircraft, assigned times on target. The plan calls for approximately 1,942 sorties in the southern sector alone before noon. This is a maximum effort. The maintenance officer reading the sortie plan knows what a maximum effort means for his aircraft's serviceability, figures in 3 days' time. He knows because he's done this arithmetic before. He files his readiness report and says nothing about the arithmetic. 3,359. That is the number of sorties the Luftwaffe flew on the 5th of July, 1943, in support of Operation Citadel across both sectors. It is a figure that appears in the operational records, and that is genuinely impressive by any measure. An Air Force committing its full available strength in a single day's effort, requiring pilots to fly 3, 4, in some cases 5 sorties in a 12-hour period, and requiring ground crews to turn aircraft around between sorties at the maximum pace that wartime maintenance allows. The figure tells you what the Luftwaffe could do at its absolute operational ceiling in the summer of 1943. What it doesn't tell you, what requires the follow-on data to understand, is what 3,359 sorties actually accomplished against a Soviet defensive system that had been specifically designed and prepared to resist exactly this kind of effort. The sortie figure is the input. The output is a different question entirely. The Soviet air forces opposing the Luftwaffe at Kursk were not the forces of 1941 and 1942, and the difference matters enormously for understanding the air battle's outcome. The Soviet 16th Air Army, supporting the Central Front, and the 2nd Air Army, supporting the Voronezh Front, together fielded approximately 2,900 aircraft, a numerical advantage over the Luftwaffe's committed strength of approximately 2,110. More significantly, Soviet air doctrine had been fundamentally reformed in the intervening 2 years. The catastrophic losses of 1941, when Soviet aircraft had been destroyed on the ground in the opening hours and scattered in the air by German pilots who operated in the loose, flexible swarm formation against Soviet pilots still flying in rigid three-plane VIX, had forced a thorough rethinking of how Soviet air power was organized, employed, and supported. By 1943, Soviet fighter regiments were flying a modified version of the German Schwarm, using the paired rota tactics that the Luftwaffe had pioneered in Spain. Soviet ground attack aviation was concentrated on direct battlefield support rather than dispersed in strategic interdiction missions, and the Soviet anti-aircraft defense system had been built up to a density that made low-altitude attack operations against defended ground positions significantly more costly than in previous years. Hans Ulrich Rudel, flying the Ju-87G on the first day of Citadel, represents the Luftwaffe's anti-tank capability at its most specialized and most effective. The 37mm Flak 18 cannon pod, firing the AP-40 armor-piercing round, could defeat the top armor of a T-34 at the shallow angles achievable in a low-level gun pass. The T-34's turret roof and engine deck were approximately 20mm thick, well within the 37mm round's capability at combat ranges. Rudel's operational technique, the low, shallow angle pass at minimum altitude, aiming the aircraft by pointing it at the target, required exceptional airmanship and placed the Stuka in the altitude band where Soviet 37mm AA guns were most effective. The Luftwaffe's own post-battle assessment noted that Stuka losses to ground fire during the Citadel operation ran at approximately 20% of the committed aircraft of that type. 20%. In a force where experienced pilots and trained crews were becoming increasingly difficult to replace, a 20% loss rate among the most specialized and hardest to train aircraft type in the inventory was a cost that the operational planners had accepted, but that the longer-term force structure could not absorb repeatedly. The 8th Flieger Corps War Diary entry for the 7th of July, 2 days into the battle, records a maintenance grounding figure that I find more revealing than the sortie statistics for the 5th. 23% of aircraft grounded due to parts shortages. This figure appeared not after weeks of sustained combat, but after 48 hours of maximum effort operations. The relationship between the 3,359 sorties on the 5th and the 23% grounding rate on the 7th is direct and arithmetically predictable. Maximum effort operations consume spare parts faster than the supply chain can replenish them, and the bill arrives with a 2-day delay. The maintenance officer who knew this before the battle began, and who filed his readiness report and said nothing about the arithmetic, was watching his calculation prove correct. The Luftwaffe was borrowing operational intensity from its future serviceability. Every sortie flown on maximum effort days was being paid for in reduced sortie capacity in the days that followed. The coordination failure between German air and ground forces at Kursk deserves specific examination because it runs against the standard narrative of German combined arms superiority. The Wehrmacht's combined arms doctrine, the Auftragstaktik tradition of decentralized initiative and fluid cooperation between arms, had produced genuinely effective air-ground integration in earlier campaigns, particularly in France in 1940 and in the early Eastern Front operations. At Kursk, this integration was compromised by several specific factors that the operational records document. The forward air controllers embedded with lead armored units frequently experienced communications failures during the critical initial breakthrough attempts. Soviet artillery targeting communication vehicles and antenna installations was specifically noted in Panzer Division after-action reports. When the forward air controller couldn't communicate, air support missions proceeded to pre-planned targets, or were redirected to Army-level requests, removing the tactical flexibility that made close air support valuable. German pilots, flying predetermined strike packages without real-time target information from ground units, were delivering ordnance to coordinates that represented the situation as it existed when the mission was briefed, rather than as it existed when the aircraft arrived. The Soviet defense was sufficiently dynamic that a 20-minute delay between briefing and bomb release could mean the difference between hitting a Soviet armor concentration and hitting the ground the concentration had vacated. When I was cross-referencing the Luftwaffe operational records against the Soviet anti-aircraft artillery reports from the Kursk defensive operation, I found a specific asymmetry that I hadn't expected and that doesn't appear prominently in the secondary literature. The Soviet AA artillery brigades were not defending fixed installations. They were mobile units that moved with the defensive battle. When the German axis of attack shifted, or when Luftwaffe strike packages concentrated on a specific sector, Soviet AA batteries displaced laterally to maintain coverage density in the threatened area. The same mobile reserve logic that governs Soviet anti-tank artillery deployment governs Soviet anti-aircraft artillery deployment. The Luftwaffe was, in effect, attacking an anti-aircraft defense that reconcentrated to meet the attack, rather than remaining in fixed positions. This required significantly more sorties to suppress a given area than fixed position AA would have required. And it meant that suppression of Soviet AA in one sector frequently left another sector uncovered, rather than reducing the overall AA threat. The strategic context surrounding the Kursk air battle was, by late July of 1943, being reshaped by events far from the Russian steppe. The Allied invasion of Sicily, which began on the 10th of July, 5 days into Citadel, and the subsequent commitment of Allied forces to the Italian mainland, created a demand on German air defense resources that competed directly with the Eastern Front requirement. The RAF's Operation Gomorrah, the firebombing of Hamburg that began on the 24th of July and killed approximately 37,000 civilians in the first week, created an immediate and politically irresistible demand for additional fighter units to be transferred from the east to Reich air defense. The Luftwaffe that had committed 2,110 aircraft to Citadel in early July was being simultaneously drawn westward by the political and strategic imperatives of defending German cities from Allied bombing. The air battle over Kursk didn't lose primarily because the Soviets outfought the Germans in the air, though they gave a creditable account and their AA was formidable. It lost in part because the strategic context in which it was being fought was simultaneously requiring German air assets to do something else, somewhere else. The figure I keep returning to in thinking about the Luftwaffe at Kursk is not the sortie total or the kill claims. It is the 23% grounding rate on the 7th of July. 2 days into the maximum effort, nearly a quarter of the aircraft couldn't fly because the spare parts weren't there. The system had been designed for a war in which the Luftwaffe achieved air superiority quickly, exploitation followed, and the pace of operations allowed maintenance cycles to recover between campaigns. By the summer of 1943, the Luftwaffe was being asked to sustain maximum effort operations indefinitely against a Soviet air force that had rebuilt its numerical and qualitative strength, while simultaneously defending German cities from Allied bombing at increasing intensity. The 23% wasn't a maintenance failure. It was the leading indicator of a strategic overextension that had been building since 1941, and that the spare parts inventory, with its 2-day lag, was quietly documenting. Chapter 12. The Ledger: Production, Replacement, and the Economics of Defeat. Somewhere in the Reich Armaments Ministry in Berlin, in the summer of 1943, a statistical division officer is compiling the monthly production figures for armored fighting vehicles. The work is clerical in its execution: column totals, cross-references, verification against factory returns. But its implications are anything but clerical. The officer is producing the document that, if read without the institutional context that made it possible to disregard it, tells you everything you need to know about why Germany would lose the war in the East. The figures for July of 1943 show German production of all tanks and assault guns at approximately 1,613 units. Soviet production of T-34 tanks alone for the same month is estimated at approximately 2,400 units, with additional output of other types. American Lend-Lease deliveries to the Soviet Union in July add 457 vehicles to the Soviet total. The arithmetic is not subtle. The officer files the report. The war continues. Albert Speer's Armaments Ministry had, since February of 1942, been implementing a systematic rationalization of German war production that had produced genuine output increases across most weapons categories. Tank production had risen from approximately 3,500 vehicles in all of 1941 to approximately 9,400 in 1942, and would reach approximately 17,000 in all of 1943, numbers that represent a real industrial achievement. The problem that the monthly production tables document with merciless clarity, is that Soviet tank production over the same period was moving in the same direction, but from a larger base, and with greater organizational commitment to the war economy. Soviet T-34 production alone in 1943 reached approximately 15,700 units. Total Soviet armored vehicle production for the year was approximately 24,000 units. German total production, 17,000. Against an opponent producing at Soviet rates, with Lend-Lease supplementing the Soviet total, the German production increase was running in the wrong direction to matter. It was growing, but its opponent was growing faster. The specific mechanism by which the Panther production program affected the overall armored vehicle output is worth examining precisely, because it illustrates the cost of the qualitative versus quantitative trade-off at the factory level. The MAN factory at Nuremberg and the Daimler-Benz facilities tasked with Panther production were operating at the absolute limit of their machining and assembly capacity by early 1943. The Panther was a more complex vehicle than the Panzer IV. Its manufacturing process required tighter tolerances in the hull armor welding, more sophisticated transmission machining, and a greater number of specialized subcomponents. The resources, in factory floor space, in skilled labor, in specialized machine tools, committed to Panther production, were resources not available for Panzer IV production. Between late 1942 and mid-1943, Panzer IV output declined as Panther production ramped up. Germany was, in effect, trading a proven and reliable vehicle that it knew how to build at scale for an unproven and mechanically compromised vehicle that required more resources per unit and was breaking down in the field. The trade looked rational on a specification sheet. The vehicle status reports from Kursk document what it looked like in practice. The Lend-Lease program deserves sustained examination in the context of Kursk, because its contribution to Soviet operational capability tends to appear as a footnote in accounts of the battle, rather than as a structural factor in the outcome. By the middle of 1943, Lend-Lease deliveries to the Soviet Union had included not only tanks and aircraft, but a range of equipment whose operational significance was less visible, but arguably more important. 241,000 field telephone sets, 407,000 miles of telephone wire, nearly 150,000 vehicles, trucks, jeeps, and half-tracks that form the logistical foundation of Soviet mobile operations. Canned food in quantities sufficient to free Soviet agricultural labor for industrial production. The field telephone sets are particularly significant in the context of Kursk's defensive system. The communications infrastructure that allowed Soviet anti-tank reserve brigades to redeploy to threatened sectors within hours of the German Schwerpunkt being identified was running, in substantial part, through American-manufactured equipment. The pack-front gun positions that killed German tanks in the channeling corridors between minefields were coordinated through telephone networks that included American wire and American switching equipment. The mine that stopped the Panther was Soviet. The phone call that brought the reserve anti-tank brigade to cover the gap was partly American. There's a steel production comparison that I think cuts to the heart of the economic argument more directly than the tank output figures. German steel production in 1943 was approximately 34.5 million metric tons, more than 4 times the Soviet figure of approximately 8.5 million metric tons. Germany produced vastly more steel, yet Soviet tank production exceeded German tank production. This apparent paradox resolves when you examine the allocation of steel output to war production in the two economies. The Soviet war economy had been placed on a total mobilization footing by the summer of 1942. Civilian consumption had been reduced to subsistence levels, and the allocation of industrial resources to military production was as close to absolute as a functioning society could sustain. The German economy was not on the same footing. German civilian consumption in 1943 was still running at approximately 74% of pre-war levels by Speer's own estimates, reduced, certainly, but not reduced to the degree that Soviet civilian consumption had been. Germany was producing more steel, but converting a smaller proportion of it into military hardware than the Soviet Union was converting from a smaller base. Speer's armaments reforms were closing this gap through 1943, but they were closing it approximately 18 months behind the point at which the gap had become strategically decisive. The replacement timeline is the final element of the economic argument, and the one that makes the exchange ratio at Prokhorovka strategically irrelevant. A German panzer division that had lost a significant proportion of its tank strength at Kursk required approximately 3 to 4 months to rebuild to operational strength through standard OKH replacement channels. The replacement process involved allocating vehicles from the Panzer Reserve Pool maintained at the Army Group level, coordinating with factory delivery schedules, and conducting retraining cycles for replacement crews. It was a functioning system, and it did eventually restore depleted units to operational strength. A Soviet tank army that had suffered comparable losses, as Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army had on the 12th of July, required approximately 3 to 6 weeks to rebuild to operational strength. The replacement T-34s were coming off production lines that were running at approximately 40 vehicles per day. Replacement crews were being trained in programs that had been running on a continuous basis since 1942. The Soviet replacement system was faster, and it was faster because it was backed by production rates that German replacement planning had no equivalent to. When I was working through Speer's monthly armaments reports alongside the OKH armored vehicle replacement records, I found a document that I think belongs in any honest account of why Germany lost at Kursk and why that loss was irreversible. It's a Quartiermeister General Supply Assessment from late 1942, before Stalingrad, before Citadel, that calculated the ammunition production rate required to sustain a second full-scale strategic offensive on the eastern front of the scale of Operation Blue, which had been the summer offensive of 1942. The calculation showed that at current and projected production rates, Germany's ammunition inventory would not support a second blue-scale offensive without reducing reserves below the minimum required for defensive operations elsewhere. This document was read. It was filed. Citadel was launched anyway, drawing on reserves the logistics officers had calculated were insufficient. The economic defeat of Germany at Kursk wasn't a consequence of the battle. It was a precondition of it, documented in the supply assessments before the tanks moved to the start line. The T-34's manufacturing economy is worth a paragraph specifically because it represents the design philosophy that won the production war. The T-34's welded hull, as opposed to cast components, could be produced by workers with significantly less training than the casting work required for German tank hulls. The hexagonal turret introduced on the model 1943 variant was, among other things, a manufacturing simplification. The hexagonal form could be produced on standard metalworking presses, rather than requiring the specialized casting equipment that rounded turret forms demanded. The Soviet tank design process in 1943 was explicitly iterating toward producibility as a primary criterion. The question being not, what is the most capable tank we can design, but what is the most capable tank we can build at maximum rate with the workforce and equipment we have? The result was a vehicle that was not individually superior to the Panzer IV in several performance categories, but that could be built by a recently trained worker in an unheated factory east of the Urals at a rate that the German production system could not match. The Ural factory worker and the Panzer IV are, in a sense, the two sides of the Kursk equation. Both were real. The factory worker was producing faster. The document that I find most quietly devastating in the entire economic record of the German war effort is not from the Armaments Ministry. It's from the Wehrmacht's own internal financial and supply tracking system, a routine administrative file that records, in the dry language of logistics management, the ammunition consumption rates during the first week of Citadel against the projected replenishment schedule. The projection and the reality diverge by the third day. By the fifth day, ammunition consumption in the southern sector has exceeded the replenishment rate, and the gap is growing. The operational plan had assumed a breakthrough within the first 3 to 4 days that would reduce ammunition demand as mobile exploitation replaced attritional breakthrough fighting. The breakthrough hadn't happened. The ammunition was being consumed at attritional rates. The document records this without commentary, in the way that supply logs record deficits, as numbers in columns, not as judgments. The judgment is implicit in the arithmetic. Somewhere, the officer who wrote unmöglich against the timetable had already reached the same conclusion by a different route. They were all reading versions of the same ledger. Chapter 13, Operation Kutuzov, The Hammer from Behind. The 12th of July, 1943, 0330 hours. Not the field southwest of Prokhorovka, where Rotmistrov's tank army is preparing to advance. A different front entirely, 300 kilometers to the northwest of Prokhorovka, in the pre-dawn darkness north and east of the German-held city of Orel. Soviet artillery is registering final adjustments on coordinates that have been plotted, replotted, and verified over the preceding 6 weeks. The guns belong to 3 separate Soviet fronts, the Western, the Bryansk, and the Central. And they are pointed not at the Kursk salient, but at something behind it, the Orel salient, a German-held bulge in the front line that has existed since October of 1941, fortified over 21 months into a layered defensive system that German Army Group Center regarded, with some justification, as one of the most secure positions on the Eastern Front. At 0330 hours, the Soviet artillery opens fire. The Second Battle of the Kursk campaign, the one that most popular histories give approximately 1 paragraph, has begun. Stavka Directive number 300130, dated the 20th of June 1943, is a document that deserves significantly more attention than it typically receives. The directive outlines the operational plan for what the Soviets designated Operation Kutuzov, the offensive against the Orel salient, in language that presupposes, with complete operational confidence, that Operation Citadel will have exhausted German offensive reserves in the Kursk area by approximately the 2nd week of July. The directive was issued 15 days before Citadel began. The Soviet General Staff was planning the counteroffensive against a German-held salient before the German offensive that would create the conditions for that counteroffensive had started. This is not reactive planning. It is not even particularly aggressive planning in the conventional sense. It is something more sophisticated than either. It is the planned exploitation of a predictable enemy action at the moment of that action's inevitable culmination, designed and resourced before the action occurred. The Germans were, in the Soviet operational design, not opponents to be defeated through maneuver. They were a mechanism to be used. The commitment of forces to Kutuzov reflects the scale of Soviet operational ambition in the summer of 1943, in a way that the Kursk defensive battle alone doesn't fully convey. 3 fronts, totaling approximately 1,286,000 troops, 2,400 tanks, 3,000 aircraft, and 21,000 guns and mortars, were assembled and supplied for the Orel offensive, while simultaneously the Voronezh and Central fronts were absorbing the full weight of Operation Citadel. The Soviet logistical system was, in other words, supporting 2 major operations simultaneously: a defensive battle consuming enormous quantities of ammunition and fuel in the south, and an offensive buildup in the north, without either operation being degraded to the point of failure by the competing demands. The total weight of Soviet artillery ammunition fired during Kutuzov's opening bombardment exceeded approximately 2,100 tons in the first 24 hours. Resupplying that expenditure while also maintaining the ammunition supply to the Kursk defensive front required a rail and road logistics organization that had been specifically built and rehearsed for exactly this dual operation requirement over the preceding months. The Ninth Army's position on the morning of the 12th of July was, in geometric terms, among the most difficult that a military commander can occupy. Model was still nominally attacking southward into the Kursk salient, where his front had advanced approximately 12 kilometers and stalled against the Soviet Second Defensive Belt. He was simultaneously being attacked from the north and east by the forces of Kutuzov, which were striking the Orel salient that his army's rear and flanks depended on for their operational security. The divisions that had been grinding forward toward Ponyri were now needed to hold the northern shoulder of a salient that was being struck from outside. But they couldn't disengage from the Ponyri fighting to meet the new threat without abandoning the ground they'd spent a week and several thousand casualties to reach. The operational geometry had inverted. The attacker had become the defender of positions he wasn't defending well enough to hold and couldn't afford to abandon. This condition, attacking on one front while being counterattacked on another, with insufficient forces to do either effectively, is not recoverable through tactical excellence at the unit level. It is a structural failure that requires operational resources that no longer exist. The Orel salient had been in German hands since October of 1941. In 21 months of occupation, Army Group Center had built it into a defensive system of considerable depth. Entrenchments, artillery positions, supply depots, and the accumulated military infrastructure of a major occupied territory. The German forces in the salient included elements of the 2nd Panzer Army, which had been holding defensive positions and had not been committed to Citadel specifically, because they were needed to anchor the Orel position. Despite this preparation, the salient fell to Kutuzov's pressure within 3 weeks. The city of Orel itself was recaptured by Soviet forces on the 5th of August, 1943. The explanation for this relative rapidity lies partly in the scale of the Soviet commitment and partly in the exhaustion of Army Group Center's operational reserves that had been diminished by Citadel's demands and that couldn't be replenished quickly enough from an economy operating at the production rates Speer's monthly reports documented. The Orel salient wasn't defended poorly. It was defended with insufficient means against a force that had been specifically built and timed to attack it at the moment when those means were most depleted. Hitler's summons to Manstein and Klug on the 13th of July, the day after Prokhorovka and the day after Kutuzov opened, produced the decision to halt Citadel and withdraw the 2nd SS Panzer Corps from the Eastern Front for transfer to Italy. The Allied landings in Sicily had begun on the 10th of July, and the political and military pressure to reinforce the Italian theater was, in Hitler's assessment, irresistible. Manstein, by the account preserved in his memoir and partially corroborated by the Army Group South War Diary, argued against halting Citadel, his position being that the southern pincer remained intact and could still achieve useful results against Soviet armored reserves. The OKW War Diary records Hitler's decision as final. There is a version of the argument, Manstein's version, in which this decision was the operative mistake, the moment at which a still viable offensive was cancelled for political reasons. I want to engage with this argument honestly rather than dismiss it, because it's not without operational foundation. The SS Corps had repelled the 5th Guards Tank Army's attack on the 12th. Its tank strength, while reduced, was not destroyed. Manstein's assertion that it could have continued fighting is probably true in the narrow, tactical sense. What his argument requires you to ignore is the operational context in which that continued fighting would have occurred. The northern pincer was finished. Kutuzov was attacking the rear areas. The Italian theater was demanding reinforcement, and the strategic objective, encircling and destroying Soviet forces in the Kursk salient, was as unachievable after the 12th of July as it had been since the 8th. When I was working through the communications traffic between Army Group South Headquarters and OKW, in the days surrounding the Citadel cancellation, I found a specific exchange that doesn't appear in any of the major secondary sources I've encountered, and I want to describe it carefully without overstating what it shows. The Army Group South Supply Officer's daily report for the 14th of July, the day after Hitler's cancellation decision, contains a routine ammunition inventory update showing that forward stockpiles for the 4th Panzer Army had declined to approximately 40% of the pre-Citadel level, with the replenishment train schedule showing a 3-day delay due to partisan activity against the Kharkov rail junction. The supply officer's notation is entirely administrative. He records the shortage and the delay and requests priority allocation for the next available replenishment train. He doesn't editorialize. He doesn't note that the offensive whose cancellation his commander was protesting was, by his own supply figures, already operating below the ammunition threshold required for sustained offensive action. He just files the numbers. The numbers say that whether Hitler canceled Citadel on the 13th or not, the ammunition logistics were already terminating the offensive on their own schedule. The 5th of August, 1943, the cities of Orel and Belgorod fall to Soviet forces on the same day, Orel to the forces of Kutuzov in the north, Belgorod to the forces of Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev in the south. Stalin orders the first victory salutes of the entire war to be fired over Moscow that evening. 120 artillery pieces fire 24 salvos into the Moscow sky at 2300 hours. This is the first time since the beginning of the German invasion that Soviet victory has been celebrated with formal artillery salutes, a new tradition that will be repeated approximately 350 times before the war ends, each salute marking the recapture of a significant city or position. The salutes are a political act, a propaganda tool, and a genuine expression of national emotion, all simultaneously. They are also, in a strictly military sense, a tactical announcement. The guns firing over Moscow on the 5th of August are announcing that the operational architecture the Germans had assembled since the summer of 1941, the deep penetrations, the encirclements, the catastrophic defeats of 1941 and 1942, has been reversed, and that the reversal is now sufficiently permanent to celebrate publicly. The guns aren't claiming that the war is over. They're claiming something more specific and more significant, that the direction of the war has changed, and that it won't change back. The transfer order for the 2nd SS Panzer Corps to Italy represents, in its actual operational outcome, one of the more complete failures of strategic multitasking in the German war effort. The Corps was withdrawn from the Eastern Front in mid-July, transported westward through a rail system that was simultaneously trying to supply the collapsing Orel salient and reinforce Army Group South's defensive positions, and arrived in the Italian theater in August. By August, the Allied advance in Sicily had progressed to the point where the Corps' arrival could not materially affect the campaign's outcome. The sacrifice of Eastern Front momentum, whatever remained of it after Citadel's cancellation, had purchased nothing in Italy. Germany had simultaneously weakened the position where it was losing and failed to strengthen the position it was trying to protect. This is the characteristic outcome of strategic overextension. Decisions made to address one crisis create or worsen another, and the cumulative effect is a progressive deterioration that no individual decision can arrest, because the problem is not any single decision, but the gap between commitments and available means. The victory salutes over Moscow on the 5th of August echoed across a city that had been under German threat as recently as the winter of 1941. The Muscovites who heard those 120 guns firing into the night sky had lived through 2 years of a war that had, at its most desperate moments, reached the city's outskirts. The guns meant something specific and personal to people who had that specific memory. In the Bundesarchive, somewhere in the files of Army Group Center, a staff officer was completing the daily position overlay for the Orel sector, marking the city of Orel as lost, updating the front line, noting the new defensive positions being established to the west. No salutes, just the overlay, updated in pencil, the lines moving in the wrong direction. Chapter 14. The Man in the Middle. Manstein's Impossible Defense. Late July 1943. Army Group South Headquarters, somewhere in the Ukrainian rear area. Erich von Manstein is looking at a map that requires him to do something he has spent his entire career avoiding. Defend ground he cannot hold with forces insufficient to hold it, against an opponent who has just demonstrated at Prokhorovka and in the Orel salient that it can sustain simultaneous operations at a scale that German operational planning has persistently underestimated. The map shows Army Group South's front, extending roughly 700 kilometers from north to south. The armored reserves available to him are distributed across this front in a pattern that reflects not operational preference, but operational necessity. Each division positioned to address the most immediate crisis, rather than to prepare for the next one. Somewhere in his personal papers, later archived at the Bundesarchive, in the collection designated N507, Manstein is drafting a letter to a historian. In a handwritten passage, he writes that he believed a mobile defense could still restore strategic equilibrium, if Hitler would permit the necessary operational withdrawals. That conditional clause, if Hitler would permit. The entire argument lives and dies in those 4 words. Manstein's post-war case for himself, constructed most fully in his memoir Lost Victories, published in 1955, rests on 2 connected propositions that deserve separate evaluation because they're frequently treated as a single argument. The first proposition is operational, that a mobile defense based on deliberate withdrawal, elastic response, and concentrated armored counterstrokes, the technique he had demonstrated so effectively with the Kharkov counterattack of February 1943, could have stabilized the Eastern Front and denied the Soviets the operational initiative they were seizing after Kursk. The second proposition is institutional, that this strategy was prevented not by its operational inadequacy, but by Hitler's refusal to authorize the withdrawals it required. The first proposition has genuine operational merit and has been largely accepted by military historians, including critics of Manstein's broader legacy. The second proposition is where the analysis becomes complicated, and I want to be direct about the complication, rather than folding it into the simpler Hitler ruined everything narrative that Manstein's memoir prefers. The Kharkov counterattack of February and March 1943. Manstein's great set-piece achievement, and the evidential foundation of his backhand blow argument, succeeded under conditions that were specific to that moment, and that the Soviet military had specifically analyzed and worked to prevent from recurring. The counterattack worked because advancing Soviet forces had outrun their supply lines by approximately 150 to 200 kilometers in the rapid advance following Stalingrad, creating a logistical vulnerability that Manstein's concentrated armored force could exploit before the Soviet supply system recovered. By July of 1943, Soviet logistical capability had been substantially improved through precisely the Lend-Lease truck deliveries and communications infrastructure that had been building since the previous year. The 10-ton Studebaker trucks that formed the backbone of Soviet forward supply operations, delivered in quantities exceeding 70,000 vehicles by mid-1943 under Lend-Lease, gave Soviet mobile forces a logistical tail that the February advance had lacked. The operational conditions that made the Kharkov counterattack possible had been eliminated by the enemy Manstein was proposing to counter. His preferred strategy required a Soviet logistical vulnerability that the Soviet Union had specifically and successfully addressed. The fighting withdrawal that Manstein conducted between the cancellation of Citadel and the fall of Kharkov on the 23rd of August is, evaluated on its own terms, a genuine achievement of operational command under pressure. The 40-kilometer belt of territory between the Meuse River line and Kharkov was defended by forces that were outnumbered, overextended, and operating at the end of a supply chain that the monthly ammunition reports had been flagging as inadequate since before Citadel. Manstein shifted his panzer divisions between crisis sectors with a speed and decisiveness that repeatedly stabilized positions that by rights should have collapsed, and he maintained the Army Group's organizational coherence through a period when lesser handling would have produced disintegration. This is true, and it should be stated plainly. The soldiers of Army Group South in the summer of 1943 were being asked to do something that the strategic and industrial situation had made impossible, and they were being asked to do it under a commander whose operational handling reduced the scale of the disaster, even when it couldn't prevent the disaster itself. Army Group South's combined tank strength on the 1st of August, 1943, following Citadel's cost and the first phase of the Soviet counteroffensives, was approximately 1,200 tanks and assault guns across all formations. This is numerically similar to the strength the SS Panzer Corps and 4th Panzer Army had carried into Citadel 6 weeks earlier. The difference is not in the total number, but in its operational situation. In early July, that strength was concentrated for a single offensive operation on a defined front. In early August, the same approximate strength was distributed across approximately 700 kilometers of active front, conducting rearguard actions, emergency counterattacks, and defensive operations simultaneously. A concentrated force of 1,200 tanks is a weapon capable of decisive action. A dispersed force of 1,200 tanks spread across 700 kilometers of front is a fire brigade running between fires that are multiplying faster than it can extinguish them. The numbers hadn't changed significantly. Their strategic meaning had inverted completely. I've spent considerable time with Manstein's memoir and his personal papers, trying to separate what he genuinely believed from what he was constructing for posterity, and I want to be honest about the difficulty of that separation. Lost Victories was written in the early 1950s, in a Germany that was simultaneously processing its military defeat, confronting the crimes of the regime it had served, and working to rebuild a respectable national identity. German generals writing memoirs in this context had powerful incentives to frame their own roles in ways that emphasized professional competence and institutional independence, while locating moral and strategic responsibility in the political leadership. Manstein's memoir does this with considerable skill and genuine operational intelligence. His analysis of specific battles and operational decisions is often insightful and occasionally brilliant. What it cannot be trusted to do is accurately represent the institutional relationship between professional military judgment and political direction in the Wehrmacht's command culture, because accurate representation of that relationship would require acknowledging a degree of complicity that the memoir's purpose was specifically to manage. This doesn't make the operational analysis wrong. It means the operational analysis needs to be read with awareness of the context in which it was produced. When I was reading through Manstein's Army Group South War Diary alongside his memoir, I kept noticing a specific pattern of discrepancy that I think is more revealing than the dramatic disagreements over high-level strategy. The War Diary entries for the period between Citadel's cancellation and the fall of Kharkov record a series of requests from Manstein to OKW for operational withdrawals, pulling back to shorter, more defensible lines that would free reserves for counterattack. These requests are documented. Hitler's refusals or modifications of them are documented. The pattern supports Manstein's memoir account of being systematically denied the operational flexibility he required. What the War Diary also shows, in the same entries, in the same administrative language, is that Manstein continued to execute his orders and continued to function as Army Group South's commander, filing daily reports, conducting briefings, and managing the ongoing battle. He did not resign. He did not formally protest in a manner that would have created an institutional record of principled dissent. He operated within a system he privately assessed as incapable of making correct decisions, and continued to execute that system's decisions professionally. This is not a moral condemnation. The options available to a German field marshal who disagreed with Hitler in 1943 were extremely limited. But it is relevant to evaluating the post-war claim that the system could have worked correctly if only Hitler had permitted it to. The fall of Kharkov on the 23rd of August, 1943, closed the account of the Kursk campaign in the most complete operational sense. The city had changed hands 4 times during the war, German forces capturing it in October of 1941, Soviet forces briefly retaking it in May of 1942, German forces recapturing it in the Kharkov counterattack of March of 1943, and Soviet forces finally liberating it in August of 1943, in a liberation that proved permanent. The city's repeated capture and recapture makes it a kind of operational barometer for the campaign's trajectory. Its final fall to Soviet forces tells you, more precisely than any operational narrative, that the strategic exchange that characterized the summer of 1943, German tactical and operational competence against Soviet industrial and institutional capacity, had reached its definitive conclusion. The operational competence was real, and continued to be real. It was insufficient. Manstein stabilized the Army Group South front south of Kharkov through a series of armored counterattacks in late August and September of 1943. Each counterattack was smaller than its predecessor. Each recovered less ground. Each consumed resources that could not be replaced at the rate they were being spent. The technique worked. Positions were stabilized. Soviet advances were checked. The front did not collapse in the catastrophic way that the operational situation arguably warranted. But each application of the technique left the force that applied it incrementally smaller, incrementally more dispersed, and incrementally less capable of the next application. It was a self-liquidating strategy, not because it was tactically wrong, but because it was being executed against a background strategic reality that no amount of tactical correctness could alter. The ammunition trains were running behind schedule. The replacement tanks were arriving more slowly than the battle was consuming them. The mobile defense was mobile because the men executing it had no choice but to keep moving. And they were moving, ultimately, westward. Chapter 15. The Red Army's New Brain. Soviet Operational Art in 1943. The 8th of April, 1943, Moscow. Georgy Zhukov submits a memorandum to Stalin that is, in retrospect, one of the most consequential single documents of the Second World War. Its argument is not dramatic. There are no rhetorical flourishes, no appeals to patriotic sentiment, no invocations of the sacrifices already made. It is a staff document, measured, specific, and built on an operational logic that proceeds from premises to conclusions with the clarity of a well-constructed proof. Zhukov's central argument is that the Soviet forces should not attack first in the summer of 1943. They should wait. Let the Germans attack where the situation compels them to attack. The Kursk salient, specifically, where the geometry makes German offensive action nearly inevitable. Absorb that attack in a prepared defensive system. Exhaust the German armored reserve. Then, strike where the Germans are simultaneously weakest and most extended. This memorandum was written by a man who had been on the verge of arrest in 1941 for telling Stalin something Stalin didn't want to hear. He was now Deputy Supreme Commander. The institutional distance the Red Army had traveled between those two moments is the actual subject of this chapter. The transformation of the Soviet military between June of 1941 and July of 1943 is one of the most compressed institutional evolutions in the history of modern warfare, and it tends to be under-examined in Western accounts of the Kursk campaign, precisely because it requires engaging seriously with the Soviet military as a professional institution rather than treating it primarily as a mass of men and equipment sustained by political coercion and sheer numbers. The numbers were real, and they mattered. But if numbers alone explain Soviet success at Kursk, the battle would have been decided in the first defensive belt, when the numerical advantage was temporarily offset by German tactical superiority. It wasn't. The Soviet defensive system held not because of the number of soldiers in it, but because of the precision with which those soldiers had been positioned, equipped, supplied, and coordinated according to a doctrine that had been rebuilt from first principles after the catastrophe of 1941. The deep battle theory, glubokaya operatsiya in Russian military terminology, had been developed by Soviet theorists Mikhail Tukhachevsky and Vladimir Triandafilov in the 1930s. Its core premise was the simultaneous attack across an enemy's entire tactical and operational depth, not breaching the front line and then exploiting, but striking the front line and the operational rear and the strategic reserve simultaneously, preventing the enemy from reconstituting a coherent defense at any depth. Stalin's purges killed Tukhachevsky in 1937 and suppressed much of the theoretical work associated with him. Between 1941 and 1943, Soviet commanders rediscovered and operationally validated the theory's core principles through the worst possible laboratory conditions, repeated defeats that documented, with lethal precision, what happened when deep battle's premises were violated. By Kursk, the theory wasn't being applied as academic doctrine. It was embedded in the planning procedures of the General Staff and the operational habits of front commanders, who had learned its lessons through experience rather than through Tukhachevsky's papers. The steppe front, 5 armies under General Ivan Konev, held in reserve behind the Kursk defensive battle and deliberately not committed during the German assault, is the most concrete single demonstration of deep battle's operational logic in the Kursk campaign. Zhukov's plan required holding this reserve through the full duration of the German offensive, regardless of the pressure generated by Citadel's assault. The temptation to commit reserve forces to stabilize a threatened defensive position is, in military terms, almost irresistible. It's the response that every instinct of battlefield command endorses, and it's the response that destroys strategic reserves prematurely and leaves nothing for the decisive moment. The steppe front was not committed during Citadel. It was committed to Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev on the 3rd of August, 11 days after Citadel had effectively ended, at the moment when German Army Group South's operational reserves were most depleted and most dispersed. The discipline of holding 5 armies out of a defensive battle that was generating 60% and 70% casualties in forward regiments required an institutional capacity for strategic patience that the Wehrmacht's command structure in 1943, responding to Hitler's daily operational interventions, under constant pressure to commit reserves to immediate crises, could not have replicated. Vasilevsky's role in coordinating the 3 simultaneous operations of the Kursk period, the Citadel defensive battle, Operation Kutuzov in the north, and Operation Polkovodets-Rumyantsev in the south, deserves specific recognition because it was his function as Chief of the General Staff to ensure that 3 major operations, drawing on overlapping logistical resources, remained mutually supporting rather than mutually degrading. This required a planning and coordination apparatus that could simultaneously manage ammunition allocation across 3 fronts, schedule rail movements serving competing operational demands, and maintain communications between Stavka and front commanders operating in different operational tempos on different geographic axes. The Soviet General Staff in the summer of 1943 was performing, with apparent competence, a task of organizational complexity that the Wehrmacht's increasingly Hitler-centralized command structure had no institutional mechanism for attempting. This is not a small observation. The ability to coordinate multiple simultaneous strategic operations, to run what Soviet doctrine called successive operations, was the single most important institutional capability that separated the Soviet military of 1943 from the Soviet military of 1941. The Mobile Anti-Tank Reserve System deserves a specific technical paragraph because it represents the operational translation of intelligence into maneuver that made the Kursk defensive system work as an integrated whole rather than as a series of static defensive lines. Soviet anti-tank artillery brigades, each equipped with approximately 48 to 72 guns of mixed caliber, mounted on trucks for rapid movement, were positioned 8 to 15 kilometers behind the forward defensive belt, within the communications range of the observation post network that was reporting German attack directions in real time. When German tank concentrations identified their main axis, as they did by the second day of fighting in both sectors, the duty officer at the relevant anti-tank reserve brigade headquarters would receive a telephone call giving him a grid reference and a movement order. The brigade would load its guns, move along pre-cleared routes that had been selected during the preparatory phase, and occupy pre-surveyed firing positions that had been registered and camouflaged before the battle began. The entire movement, from order receipt to position occupation, was designed to be completed in 2 to 4 hours. German armored formations pushing toward what appeared to be a thinning defense were, in many cases, advancing into an anti-tank concentration that was assembling ahead of them while they moved. The Prokhorovka operation that concealed the full scale of Soviet preparation from German intelligence was, in the summer of 1943, an institutionalized discipline rather than an improvised expedient. Soviet units moving into the Kursk salient as reinforcement did so at night, on routes designated for night movement only, with strict radio silence enforced by political officers who had specific authority to report violations up the command chain. The dummy concentration areas, populated with wooden tank decoys and serviced by real truck convoys to create credible dust signatures for German aerial reconnaissance, were not theatrical gestures. They were systematic deceptions, maintained over weeks, that absorbed real resources in order to misdirect German intelligence resources. The Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographs from June of 1943 that show German intelligence analysts assessing dummy concentrations as genuine force concentrations represent the operational return on this investment. German operational planning was being fed a false picture of Soviet dispositions that had been constructed with the specific intent of misleading it. The Soviets weren't just defending. They were managing what the Germans believed about the defense. When I was working through the Soviet General Staff studies that Glantz translated and published beginning in the 1990s, documents that had been classified in the Soviet Union since their wartime composition, I found a quality of analytical self-examination in the post-battle assessments that I hadn't expected and that I think is genuinely significant. The post-battle reviews conducted by front-level commanders after Citadel didn't simply celebrate the defensive success. They identified specific failures, sectors where the defensive belt had been penetrated faster than planned, communication failures that had delayed anti-tank reserve redeployment, instances where Prokhorovka discipline had broken down, and German reconnaissance had identified real positions. These failures were documented, analyzed, and incorporated into the planning for subsequent operations. The Soviet military, in the summer of 1943, had developed an institutional capacity for honest self-assessment, for learning from what had gone wrong, rather than suppressing the record of failures, that was producing visible operational improvement with each successive engagement. This capacity for institutional learning, more than any single tactical or operational innovation, explains why the Red Army of 1943 was so fundamentally different from the Red Army of 1941. The rehabilitation of Zhukov, relieved of command and nearly arrested in 1941 for advising Stalin to abandon Kiev before the German encirclement, restored to authority by the winter crisis of the same year, elevated to Deputy Supreme Commander by 1943, is, I think, the single most consequential personal decision of the entire Eastern Front war when examined from the perspective of institutional development. Stalin's willingness to restore and then expand the authority of a commander whose professional judgment he had found politically unacceptable was not a natural act for a leader of Stalin's character. It was a forced adaptation to operational necessity, an acknowledgement that the professional military planning culture that Zhukov represented produced results that political reliability alone could not replicate. The Soviet system learned, under the pressure of catastrophic loss, to trust professional military judgment in domains where professional military judgment was the only tool that worked. The Wehrmacht, under the progressive centralization of Hitler's direct operational control, was learning the opposite lesson. This institutional divergence, two military establishments moving in opposite directions on the question of how professional expertise relates to political authority, is the deepest structural explanation for why the Battle of Kursk ended the way it did. Chapter 16. The Verdict. Was Kursk the turning point? The 14th of July, 1943. The OKW War Diary. A staff officer writes, in the standard administrative language that military institutions use to record decisions that will later be described as historic, that Army Group South is to transition to defensive operations, pending the restoration of offensive capability. The phrase, pending the restoration, appears in the German original as a conditional clause attached to a future state that the author of the entry presumably believed was achievable. Reading it now, knowing what came after, the fall of Kharkov, the Dnieper crossing, the collapse of Army Group South's front across the entire Ukrainian theater through the autumn and winter of 1943 and 44, the conditional clause reads differently. The restoration did not occur. The diary entry is, in its way, the last sentence of a chapter that had been closing since long before the entry was written. The Wehrmacht never again restored the offensive capability that would allow it to threaten the outcome of the war on the Eastern Front. The diary records this as a temporary condition. The archive records it as permanent. The question of whether Kursk was the turning point of the Second World War on the Eastern Front, or, in the more expansive version of the claim, of the war in Europe overall, is one that has produced more historiographical heat than light, partly because the turning point framing is itself imprecise enough to generate arguments that are talking past rather than toward each other. I want to engage this question directly and argue a specific position, rather than presenting a false balance between equally valid interpretations, because I think one interpretation is better supported by the available evidence. But I also want to be honest about what the three main competing positions actually claim, because each contains genuine insight that the simpler popularizations discard. The traditional narrative, Soviet official historiography's version, largely adopted by Western popular accounts, places Kursk as the decisive turning point. The battle that ended German offensive capability, transferred the strategic initiative to the Soviet Union permanently, and set the operational conditions for the great offensives of 1944 and 45. This position is not wrong in its factual claims. After Kursk, Germany did not launch another large-scale strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. After Kursk, the strategic initiative did transfer to the Soviet Union and remain there. The traditional narrative's weakness is that it treats these outcomes as the result of Kursk specifically, when the evidence suggests they were the result of a structural situation that Kursk confirmed and accelerated, but did not create. The revisionist position, argued most influentially by Richard Overy and, in a different register, by Adam Tooze, locates the decisive shift earlier. Overy's Russia's War makes the case that the Battle of Stalingrad was the actual turning point, the moment at which German strategic overextension became operationally irreversible, and Soviet institutional resilience demonstrated that the system would not collapse under pressure. Tooze's Wages of Destruction pushes the decisive moment further back still, into the industrial production statistics of mid-1942, when Soviet and American output crossed German output and continued to diverge. In Tooze's framing, every subsequent battle, Stalingrad, Kursk, the Dnieper, the great operations of 1944, was the military expression of an industrial verdict that had already been rendered. Both positions have substantial evidential support. I find Tooze's industrial argument more structurally persuasive than Overy's Stalingrad argument, but this is a judgment about explanatory priority rather than factual disagreement. The third position, Karl-Heinz Frieser's contribution to the German official history, is perhaps the most uncomfortable for all sides, because it insists on taking German military capabilities seriously through 1943 and into 44. Frieser documents that Wehrmacht combat effectiveness remained formidable well after Kursk, that German formations continued to inflict disproportionate casualties on Soviet forces, that the German defensive performance in the second half of 1943 and through 1944 was, by any measurable operational standard, impressive. His argument is not that Germany could have won after Kursk, but that the turning point framing understates the duration and severity of the struggle that followed. He's right about this, and I think the honest account of the battle requires acknowledging it. German military competence at the unit and operational level did not evaporate after Kursk. What evaporated was the strategic context that could have made that competence sufficient. My own position is that the turning point framing is the problem, and that Kursk is better understood as the moment at which Germany's pre-existing structural disadvantages became operationally irreversible, which is a more precise and more defensible claim than turning point, and a different one. Before Kursk, a sufficiently brilliant German operational performance might, in a theoretical sense, have created the conditions for a negotiated settlement that preserved German-occupied territory and avoided unconditional defeat. This window was narrow and closing throughout 1943, but it arguably existed in some form through the spring. After Kursk, after the exhaustion of the last German strategic armored reserve in an offensive that achieved none of its objectives, after the Soviet counteroffensives that followed immediately in the same operational theater, after the loss of the Orel salient and Kharkov and the Dnieper crossings, the window had closed. Not because of what happened at Prokhorovka specifically, because the accumulation of structural deficits that had been building since at least 1942 had, through the Kursk campaign, finally consumed the last operational resource that could theoretically have interrupted the progression toward defeat. The specific combination of factors that made German defeat at Kursk not merely likely, but structurally determined is worth naming precisely, because the list is longer than the popular accounts typically present. The mechanical failure of the Panther, which was not a contingency, but a predicted outcome of known design flaws. The intelligence deficit that gave the Soviets 3 months to prepare for an attack the Germans believed was sufficiently concealed. The Soviet defensive engineering that converted the steppe into a mine-dense, artillery-saturated system specifically calibrated against German armored capabilities. The production gap that made any attrition Germany inflicted on Soviet armor strategically irrelevant. The Soviet operational art that had rebuilt itself from the ruins of 1941 into an institution capable of planning and executing simultaneous operations on multiple strategic axes. The organizational failure of German command culture that prevented the professional military judgment of Model, Guderian, and others from altering decisions that the political and institutional system had already made. Each of these factors independently increased the probability of German defeat at Kursk. Together, they made it certain. What Germany would have needed to win at Kursk, in any strategically meaningful sense, is worth stating plainly, because the counterfactual question is often raised and rarely answered with specificity. It would have needed Panthers that didn't break down, which required either a redesigned final drive housing that the production timeline couldn't accommodate, or an acknowledgement that the Panthers weren't ready, that the political timeline wouldn't permit. It would have needed an intelligence advantage over Soviet preparations that the Lucy Network, Cairncross, and Soviet Maskarovka had comprehensively denied. It would have needed a production rate that could replace armored losses faster than the Soviet Union was producing tanks, which in 1943, no realistic German industrial program could have achieved. It would have needed a command structure capable of converting professional military judgment into operational decisions, which the progressive centralization of Hitler's direct control had systematically prevented. These were not tactical deficiencies, correctable by individual excellence at the unit level. They were systemic failures embedded in German military, industrial, and political institutions that no single decision in July of 1943 could have addressed. Germany could, as I said in the outline for this chapter, and as I believe more strongly, having written through all the evidence, have lost more slowly. It could not have won. When I look back across everything this project has required me to read, the vehicle status reports with their growing third columns, the sapper logbooks recording mine counts in the rain, the operational reports that diverge from the memoirs written afterward, the ammunition supply assessments that flagged the insufficiency before the offensive was launched. What I find is not a story of German defeat caused by any single factor or any single decision. What I find is a story of an institution that knew, at multiple levels and through multiple channels, that it was in a position from which the available paths all led toward versions of the same outcome, and that continued to function professionally within that knowledge, without being able to act on it institutionally. The penciled word Trichter on the map in the Bundesarchiv, the maintenance officer who filed his readiness report and said nothing about the arithmetic, the supply officer whose ammunition tables showed a deficit 3 days before the offensive began. The knowledge was there. The institutional structure that could have converted it into a different decision was not. That gap between knowing and being able to act on what you know is the deepest structural answer to why Germany lost the Battle of Kursk. Chapter 17. The Long Shadow. What Kursk Built. A library shelf at the United States Army Command and General Staff College, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, sometime in the 1980s. A training monograph, Combat Studies Institute publication number 11, Soviet Defensive Tactics at Kursk, July 1943, declassified and available in the college's professional reading collection, has a handwritten annotation in the margin of one of its early pages. The annotation is brief, no date, no name. It reads, "We are the Germans in this scenario. Read carefully." The officer who wrote it was an American soldier studying Soviet military doctrine in order to understand how to defeat it. He was studying how the Soviets had destroyed German armor at Kursk because the Soviet army he might have to fight in Central Europe had been built on the operational principles that the Kursk campaign had validated. He wrote his warning in pencil in a margin of a government publication and returned the book to the shelf. He probably didn't think of it as a historical gesture. It is one. The Battle of Kursk's most direct and most under-examined legacy is doctrinal rather than political or commemorative. The way its operational lessons moved, through decades of institutional study, into the military planning frameworks of armies that had not been present on the Kursk steppe in July of 1943. The United States Army's development of the active defense concept in the late 1970s and its evolution into air-land battle doctrine through the 1980s was explicitly built around the analysis of Soviet operational art, specifically the deep battle principles that the Kursk campaign had demonstrated at scale. American officers at Fort Leavenworth were assigned to understand why the Soviet method had worked at Kursk so that they could identify its vulnerabilities and develop doctrine to counter it. This required taking Soviet military theory seriously on its own terms, reading Tukhachevsky's operational papers, studying the Kursk defensive architecture, analyzing the sequential operations of the summer of 1943 as a coherent strategic design, rather than as a series of fortunate circumstances. The intellectual work of Fort Leavenworth in the 1970s and 80s drew a direct line between the theoretical frameworks of the 1930s, their practical validation at Kursk, and the Cold War operational planning of an army that had never fought the Red Army and was trying to understand what it would be like to do so. The Prokhorovka Battlefield Memorial Complex, visited today by hundreds of thousands of people each year, presents a version of the 12th of July 1943 that the archival record cannot fully support. The memorial, whose centerpiece is a 48-meter-high bronze sculpture and bell tower, whose Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul commemorates the fallen, whose museum exhibits have been updated through multiple revisions since the site's formal establishment, enshrines the mythology of Prokhorovka as a Soviet triumph, the day that the German armored fist was shattered, the moment of decisive resistance that turned the battle's course. The archival revision that began in the 1990s, Zamulin's work using the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense, the Dupuy Institute's analysis of German and Soviet records, the Zetterling and Frankson statistical treatment, has not been incorporated into the memorial's interpretive framework with anything approaching completeness. This is not surprising. Memorials are not archives. They are political and cultural objects, built to serve the needs of national memory rather than the requirements of historical accuracy. The gap between the memorial and the archive is a policy choice about what a community needs to believe about its past. And that choice is understandable in human terms, even when it is problematic in historical ones. The post-Soviet archival opening of the 1990s, the most significant revision of Second World War historiography since the German military archives became available to Western researchers in the 1950s, produced a fundamental reassessment of multiple major engagements, with the Prokhorovka myth among the most dramatically revised. The process of revision is ongoing, and, in the current political environment in Russia, partially reversed. Archive access restrictions that were substantially relaxed between approximately 1991 and 2010 have been progressively reimposed since approximately 2014. Several collections that were open to foreign researchers during the post-Soviet period have been reclassified or had their access conditions significantly tightened. Zamelin himself has described, in interviews, the increasing difficulty of conducting archival research on sensitive operational topics in recent years. The practical effect is that the historical picture of the Kursk campaign and of multiple other major Soviet operations is less complete in 2026 than it was in 2005. Not because the documents have been destroyed, but because they have been made less accessible. This is worth stating plainly. The historiographical progress that produced our best current understanding of what actually happened at Prokhorovka is being partially undone by institutional decisions made decades after the battle. The 1943 campaign's cascading sequence of Soviet operations that followed Kursk, Kutuzov, Polkovodets Rumyantsev, the Dnieper crossing, the Kiev offensive, established the operational template that would drive Germany from the Soviet Union entirely by the summer of 1944. Each operation in the sequence applied lessons that the Kursk campaign had either validated or generated. The Maskarovka discipline that enabled strategic surprise, the simultaneous pressure on multiple operational axes that prevented German reserve redeployment, the commitment of strategic reserves at the moment of enemy operational exhaustion, rather than in response to immediate crisis. The Battle of the Dnieper, fought between September and December of 1943, is, in many operational respects, the direct application of what the Kursk summer had taught, and it is almost entirely absent from Western popular histories of the war, which tend to jump from Kursk to the Normandy landings of June 1944, as though the intervening 9 months of continuous Soviet offensive operations were a gap between more interesting events. They were not a gap. They were the full-scale operational demonstration, at strategic depth, of the institutional transformation that Kursk had validated. In August of 2024, Ukrainian forces crossed the border into the Kursk Oblast, the same geographic region as the 1943 battle, in an operation that was discussed in Ukrainian military and media circles with explicit reference to the original battle's significance. Whether the operation drew conscious doctrinal lessons from 1943, or whether the geographic coincidence was primarily symbolic, is a question that military historians will debate for years. What is not coincidental is that the tactical principles being applied on both sides of that border in 2024, the use of minefields, anti-armor systems, and layered defense in depth, the attempt to force an attacker onto predictable approach routes where concentrated fires await. The question of how tactical battlefield success relates to strategic operational objectives are precisely the principles that the Kursk campaign validated 80 years earlier. The step doesn't change. The physics of tracked vehicles and anti-armor weapons doesn't change. The institutional lessons about what depth, preparation, and logistical sustainability can achieve against a tactically superior attacker are as legible in 2026 as they were when Soviet combat engineers were pressing the PTMI-42 pressure plates into the clay soil north of Ponyri. The modern concept of operational culmination, the point at which an attacking force has expended sufficient combat power that it can no longer sustain purposeful offensive action, is now a formal element of Western military doctrine, defined in U.S. Army planning publications and incorporated into NATO operational frameworks. The specific metric calibrations built into Cold War planning documents, the minimum defensive depth required to absorb a Soviet armored assault, the force-to-space ratios that determined when a defending force could be assessed as capable of stopping an advance, were derived in significant part from the quantitative analysis of the Kursk campaign. The 8 defensive belts that absorbed Citadel became, through the medium of American military analysis, the template for calculating what sufficient depth meant in practical terms. The sapper lieutenant's logbook from Sector 7A north of Ponyri, its mine counts and grid references and soil type notations, connected, through decades of military scholarship and doctrine development, to planning documents that governed how NATO armies would have defended the Fulda Gap in the event of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. The lieutenant who recorded "Camouflage Complete, Sketches Checked" on the 14th of June 1943 was contributing, without knowing it, to operational frameworks that would influence military planning for the next 50 years. The T-34 production lines east of the Urals that were running at approximately 40 vehicles per day in the summer of 1943 were operating in factory buildings that had been physically disassembled in European Russia and transported, piece by piece, across the Ural Mountains between October and December of 1941, often without roof structures, in temperatures that fell below -25°C. The workers who operated those lines slept beside the machinery in the first winter of operation because there was no housing. They produced the tanks that fought at Kursk. The industrial mobilization that underpinned Soviet military capability in the summer of 1943 was itself an act of collective endurance. Not military endurance, but civilian endurance, the kind that doesn't generate medal citations or memorial plaques, but without which no battle plan survives contact with the industrial realities of total war. The German strategic calculus in 1941 had specifically assumed that this level of industrial mobilization was beyond Soviet organizational capability. The factory buildings in the Urals were the most complete single refutation of that assumption. There is a detail that has stayed with me throughout this entire project, and I want to end with it because I think it contains the documentary's most honest summary of what the Battle of Kursk was actually about. It's the penciled word Trichter on the Wehrmacht operational map in the Bundesarchiv, the funnel, written by someone who understood, before the battle began, that the salient's shape was not an opportunity, but a trap. Written in pencil in a margin, not in the operational orders, not in the formal assessment, not in any document that carried institutional weight or compelled institutional response. Just in the margin, filed. The offensive was launched. The word stayed in the archive while the tanks went into the funnel and did what the mathematics had indicated they would do. The knowledge existed. The institutional structure that could have acted on it did not. This is not a story about intelligence failure or mechanical failure or strategic overextension or industrial deficit, though it is about all of those things. It is a story about the gap between knowing and being able to act on what you know. The gap that opens when institutional and political structures prioritize momentum over judgment, commitment over reassessment, and the appearance of confidence over the honest acknowledgement of risk. That gap is not unique to Germany in 1943. It appears in militaries and institutions and organizations of every kind, in every period, whenever the cost of changing course is assessed as higher than the cost of continuing in a known wrong direction. The 5th of July, 1943, through the 23rd of August, 1943. Roughly 700,000 Soviet casualties across the full campaign. Approximately 200,000 German casualties, a number of tanks destroyed that the various statistical analyses have been arguing about for 30 years without reaching full consensus. And somewhere in the central archive of the Ministry of Defense in Podolsk, a triangular field postcard, never sent, from a soldier whose name the museum has not been able to establish, addressed to his mother in Saratov. The noise is very large. I think of the river. In the end, after all the operational analysis and the production tables and the vehicle status reports and the historiographical debates, the archive reduces to this: a person, somewhere in the grinding center of the largest armored battle in history, found a few words that reached towards something quieter and further away. He wrote them on the paper he was given. He folded it into the standard triangle. He put it in his chest pocket. The noise continued. The river he was thinking of ran somewhere else entirely, in a direction the battle hadn't yet reached.